From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $80 million studio. I'm the Pro Wrestle Machine. Continuing on with June 1998, an amazing time in wrestling. And a look at one of the greats, Junkyard Dog. Let's dive in. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. June 8, 1998 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. Junkyard Dog Obituary. More. By Observer Staff. A look at the life and death of Junkyard Dog, a full review of WWF Over the Edge, and tons more. June 8, 1998. Just as we were going to press came confirmation that the Junkyard Dog was killed at approximately 11:40 a.m. on June 2nd in a highway accident in Mississippi. JYD, as he was known during a pro wrestling career that saw him among the biggest drawing cards in the game during the period from 1980 to 1986, was driving on Interstate 20 in central Mississippi near Forest, Mississippi when he is believed to have fallen asleep at the wheel and crashed. It is believed he was either driving to or from his daughter's college graduation, either from or back to his home in Charlotte. Born Sylvester Ritter on December 13, 1952, he played college football in the Carolinas and had a brief tryout with the Green Bay Packers before starting in pro wrestling under the name Big Daddy Ritter for Stampede Wrestling and the IWE in Japan in 1978. Because of his size, being about 6'3" and 265 pounds at the time, he was a headliner in Stampede even though unknown, capturing the North American title from Alo Leilani on December 1, 1978 in Calgary before dropping it about 5 months later to Jake Roberts. But he became a superstar name for Bill Watts Mid-South Wrestling after being christened the Junkyard Dog in 1979, where he skyrocketed to the top position in the promotion, particularly after word got around pro wrestling in 1980 of a match he had against Michael Hayes that drew 26,000 fans to the Superdome in New Orleans, where the gimmick was that JYD actually wrestled the match blind since Hayes had 6 weeks earlier ended his career with the famed free bird cream to the eyes. That same angle was reprised in Atlanta 1 year later, although never to the same degree or with the same financial results. That figure put both the Freebirds and JYD on the map. After winning the match while supposedly blind, once his sight miraculously recovered, the fans thought he was an unbeatable Superman, and Watts was careful never to let him disappoint them. While a poor worker, actually among the worst headliners around, his interviews and powerhouse physique at the time transformed him into the biggest hero, particularly among African American fans, not only in Watts' circuit, but he became the prototype black babyface superstar that the business had been looking for ever since the heyday of Bobo Brazil. Promoters around the country brought him in for big shows while he maintained his spot as the top star in Watts' office. Watts used a lot of promotional tricks, from usually surrounding him with great workers to carry his matches, or keeping his matches short, and giving him entrance music. Along with the Freebirds and Bad Leroy Brown, they were the only wrestlers during that time period to have what became later the standard musical ring entrance, a gimmick that spread quickly like wildfire. The classic "Another One Bites the Dust" became synonymous to wrestling fans around the world, to JYD dancing to the ring with his dog collar around his neck. For several years, Watts kept JYD's record spotless as far as losing singles matches, particularly in Louisiana, making him the babyface who never would tease the fans with the chase but never quite win the big title. Eventually, he had to give the fans that title, but once that happened, the drawing power started to slow. After Watts experimented in trying to get a heel Mr. Wrestling 2 over by pinning JYD with a foreign object finish that badly missed in New Orleans on March 12, 1984, the gates in what had been Watts' biggest money city plummeted amazingly fast, which only served to emphasize what had been something of a doctrine in those days about never cleanly beating a top black babyface. By that time, JYD's fame spread nationally when his feud with the fabulous Freebirds, that started in Mid-South, spread to Georgia, which had national television coverage due to TBS, and JYD was imported to team with the likes of Ted DiBiase and Robert Fuller against the Freebirds in late 1980 and continued to work occasional big shows in Atlanta, where he picked up a huge fan following due to the high television ratings of the wrestling show and his own charisma, interviews, and physique and uniqueness of being one of the few wrestlers of the time to have entrance music. JYD remained Watts' top draw, earning in the range of $150,000 in the early 1980s, a huge figure at the time, and headlined several more shows at the Superdome that drew in excess of 20,000 fans, generally feuding with partners such as DiBiase, Ernie Ladd, Hacksaw Butch Reed, and Mr. Olympia that turned on him. He was among the earliest big names to walk out of a promotion without giving any notice at all, when he left Watts high and dry with weeks of advertised main events on the books and start working immediately on Vince McMahon's television in the early stages of the wrestling war in 1984. While Mid-South actually drew better after he left with a faster-paced, more work-rate-oriented product, Watts made attempt after attempt to create a new black Superman as a drawing card in Louisiana, and every attempt failed, some worse than others. His final famous match at the Superdome was under a mask as Stagger Lee after he'd lost a loser leaves town match, teaming with Bill Watts to beat the Midnight Express of Bobby Eaton and Dennis Condrey before 23,000 fans. He was almost immediately the number 2 babyface in the WWF behind Hulk Hogan, frequently teaming with him in main events and earning in the range of $400,000 in his best years, although he was said to have been broke by the 90s. He worked singles programs with many of the top stars, most notably the likes of Greg Valentine, Terry Funk, Don Morocco, Adrian Adonis, and Harley Race. The high point of his WWF tenure had to come on November 7, 1985, in the WWF's first ever specifically made for pay-per-view event called the Wrestling Classic from Chicago, a 16-man one-night tournament. JYD was the eventual winner, beating Iron Sheik, Moondog Spot, and getting a bye into the finals where he beat Randy Savage via count out in a match Savage actually carried to a good one. McMahon protected JYD like Watts did, with him never doing jobs. However, his time in the WWF spotlight was cut short by personal problems which caused frequent no-shows and left him with a reputation for unreliability. By the famous WrestleMania 3 at the Pontiac Silverdome on March 29, 1987, his stock had dropped to the point he put over Harley Race in just 422 and was never given any kind of a big push after that. The unreliability combined with his weight problem ended his career as one of the biggest drawing cards in the country long before that point. However, his name was one of the biggest made during the period when WWF was first on network television bi-weekly in 1985 and 1986, and he lived off his name working occasional unsuccessful WWF comebacks and a few WCW runs where they attempted and failed to recapture his once great drawing power. In recent years, with his weight at around 375 pounds, he was limited to working independents largely in Louisiana and Mississippi, where he was once the biggest name. His final national appearance would have been on May 3 in Marietta, Georgia for the ECW WrestlePalooza pay-per-view, where he got into a brief brawl with New Jack before going to the ring and getting a surprisingly huge reaction. Junkyard Dog. Career title history. Source: Wrestling Title History's 3rd edition, Wrestling Observer Newsletter Records. Jid held the North American Heavyweight title a few times. He defeated Bob Roop back on June 21, 1982 in New Orleans, only to lose it to Ted DiBiase on June 13 in Shreveport. But as Stagger Lee, Jid came back strong and defeated DiBiase on November 25, 1982, in New Orleans. Later, he would go on to win the title twice more, with his final reign ending on March 12, 1984. Jid also had his share of success in the Louisiana heavyweight division. He won the title from Ernie Ladd on March 14, 1980, in Shreveport, and later from Great Kabuki on December 7, 1981, in New Orleans. Jid was forced to vacate the title in June 1982 after winning the North American title. Down in Mississippi, Jid took home the heavyweight title after defeating Bull Ramos in 1980. Unfortunately, he had to vacate the title after getting injured by the Freebirds. Jid's tag team prowess can't be overlooked either. Alongside various partners, he won the Mid-South tag team title multiple times throughout the early 80s. Some of his memorable partners include Buck Robley, Terry Orndorff, Killer Carl Cox, Dick Murdoch, and Mr. Olympia, Jerry Stubbs. Lastly, Jid teamed up with Tommy Rich and Ricky Morton to win the WCW 6-man title on February 17, 1991, in Atlanta. They eventually lost the titles to Michael Hayes, Jimmy Garvin, and Badstreet Brad Armstrong on June 3, 1991, in Birmingham, Alabama. With WCW online for 2 of the biggest shows in company history in early July, the manipulation and jockeying for positioning began in a big way, stemming from a secret meeting at Hulk Hogan's house on May 31st. It appears the main wrestling topics of conversation at the meeting, which included Hogan's basic crew of the Giant, Randy Savage and Ed Leslie, revolved around the main event of the July 12th Bash at the Beach pay-per-view from San Diego, which features Dennis Rodman. Hogan, whose career skyrocketed after getting a minor celebrity rub from appearing with Sylvester Stallone in Rocky III, and a much bigger one from Mr. T and Cyndi Lauper as the WWF went national in late 1984 and early 1985, was to a degree of being more than comical. Surgically attacked to Rodman's hip at all times last year as Rodman propelled WCW to tons of mainstream media publicity from his appearances on a Nitro and 2 pay-per-view shows, including wrestling a match last year. While Rodman is not the media star as he was 1 year ago, He is still a big media name and one of the most colorful players in the NBA and a top star with the Chicago Bulls, who are the most famous team in the finals of the playoffs, in the second hottest sport but the most visible for specific individuals as far as a team sport in the country. In addition, it is no secret that WCW is expecting Rodman not to be the only celebrity involved in that show. The planned main event for the Bash appeared to have been Hogan and Rodman against Diamond Dallas Page and another celebrity. However, Hogan at the meeting tried to get Page moved out of the main event and replaced by Savage, figuring the media rub because of the celebrities would be better served by being to a member of his crew. In addition, the basic belief is that as a pay-per-view main event draw because of name value, that Savage means far more than Page, so it is the right move business-wise. Page's name being involved immediately stood out as a political favor, whereas Savage's name in that spotlight makes more sense both name-wise and storyline-wise. It is not certain, but there is some conjecture that Page got the main event slot, not so much from his well-known association with Eric Bischoff, but from his role in securing another celebrity as being his tag team partner, and thus the company benefited from his recruiting. Exactly how much of this was Page's doing and how this story turns out puts Bischoff in an interesting position on a number of levels, since it's his final call, and the belief is that Savage will wind up with the slot. In addition, WCW will almost surely set its all-time attendance record and already broke its all-time gate record with a shocking first day of ticket sales on May 29th for its Nitro on July 6th at the Georgia Dome. With no matches announced, WCW sold 14,546 tickets for $541,120 on the first day. The current all-time gate record for a WCW event was $541,000 exactly for the Starrcade Hogan vs. Sting match from the MCI Center in Washington, D.C. on December 28th. So that record was broken on the first day. As of the end of business on June 1st, those numbers had grown to 17,179 tickets sold for $623,495. And there are certain group sale numbers not figured in that probably would account for about another $25,000. The all-time record for the WCW company for attendance was set for the first Nitro at the Georgia Dome on January 5th, with 23,058 paid and 26,773 in the building. What makes this show even more intriguing was that over the weekend, Hogan volunteered to work a dark match on the show, suggested that his opponent be Bill Goldberg, and since it would be a non-title match and Hogan has no problem overdoing clean jobs when it isn't televised, one would think he made it clear he wasn't going to harm Goldberg's winning streak. This is one of the reasons Hogan is where he is in the business. All those tickets have already been sold without anyone having any knowledge of the match. No doubt when the match is officially announced locally in about 1 week, it should help sales even more, and being that it is the final Nitro before the San Diego pay-per-view show, both Rodman and the other celebrity are expected to shoot a major angle at the show and are expected to be pushed heavily starting in about 2 weeks as being at the show. WCW was originally planning on a 24,000-seat setup for the show, but has now changed plans and is looking at a 38,000-seat setup and could approach a $1 million live gate for the first time in company history and the first time ever in the United States for a company other than the WWF to reach that figure, which the WWF has broken on 6 occasions. When all is said and done and the event is over, it won't be remembered as WCW Nitro drawing the house or Rodman doing an angle somewhere during the TV show drawing the house. It'll be Hogan and Goldberg drawing the house. Most importantly, to the Turner/Time Warner bigwigs, some of whom will be in the building that night, be amazed at the crowd for a wrestling event, and attribute it to Hogan since he's the biggest name wrestling in the main event. Of course, in a business where all plans change depending upon what happens at 4 p.m. on Tuesday, if WCW is in a tough ratings war, and given the results of this past week that would seem likely, it would be no surprise to see the Hogan-Goldberg match get major hype on a national basis and wind up on television when all is said and done. Even though that definitely was not the plan when Hogan suggested the match. After the closest Monday night ratings race in the 3-year history of Nitro and a major drop in combined viewing levels attributed to Memorial Day on May 25th, viewing levels declined once again on June 1st, with Raw coming out with its biggest win in 2 years. For June 1st, the Raw from the Chicago Rosemont Horizon drew a 4.35 rating, 4.28 first hour, 4.42 seconds hour, and 7.08 share, while Nitro from the MCI Center in Washington, D.C. had its lowest rating in its regular time slot of the year, doing a 3.72 rating, 4.01 first hour, 3.36 seconds hour, 3.78 third hour, and a 6.37 share. The combined 2 hours head-to-head saw Raw take all 8 quarters and finish with a 4.35 to 3.57 margin of victory. its biggest margin since the earliest days of Nitro. An important note when considering that margin of victory is that WCW's star power, which has carried the show many weeks when the quality wasn't of the show was far from top-notch, was there in force with Hogan, Savage, Piper, Sting, Luger, Giant, Nash, Hart, and basically every big gun on its roster lived in some sort of a focal role with the exception of Ric Flair and Scott Hall. It's also interesting to point out two other facts, since for years Hulk Hogan has been the master at the game of business chess, pulling out and showing up at the opportune time. Despite Nitro being bounced around for the NBA playoffs, it appears the buy rate for the WCW Slamboree pay-per-view without Hogan, he was there doing the cameo run-in for Hart vs. Savage but wasn't advertised, was about the same as for Spring Stampede the previous month with Hogan and coming off a build-up period where WCW was drawing record TV ratings. And similarly, with WWF having the Prime Monday slot to itself several weeks leading to Over the Edge and drawing record ratings, its buy rate declined greatly from Unforgiven, let alone any comparison that would be unfair for many reasons with WrestleMania. Anyway, Hogan didn't work that pay-per-view, smartly realizing bouncing around the time slot would hurt the build, yet the buy rate didn't decline. Then he didn't appear on Memorial Day, and on paper intelligently since it was the first week back after being bounced around and WWF should have won that night, but it was a tie. Then when he showed up on June 1st, the rating tumbled. While he is jumping on the Atlanta Big Gate momentum, this is the first strong sign that Hogan's seeming business magic has declined to perhaps not being all that significant, which coincides with Steve Austin's rapid ascension as the new top star in the game. While WCW's rapid decline in numbers from just a few weeks ago is significant, just as wrestling has been soaring to record ratings and just as people inside were predicting it was a hot-shotted supernova that would cool off almost as fast, this past week may have been an indication of that as well. What appears now to have been the high-water mark of wrestling's popularity in the current cycle was the night of April 20th when the two shows combined head-to-head for a 9.48 rating and 14.82 share and reached 6,920,000 total homes. This past week those figures declined to a composite 7.92 rating and 12.89 share in 5,813,000 homes, or a 16% decline in viewership over a 6-week period. WCW's numbers declined over that same period 30%, while the WWF numbers have stayed even, after getting the artificial increase when Nitro was in a different slot and there was no head-to-head competition. One can view what is happening not so much as a decline in wrestling interest on Mondays based on that, but interest in WWF staying steady and a massive decline in interest in WCW. During that same 6-week period, WCW has turned Hart, Giant, Sting, Luger, Hall, which then didn't count because it was never talked about again, and Rhodes, which nobody cared about, with basically no build or logic to any one of those turns, and the pattern of what is happening now and what happened to the preceding company in 1987 to 88 when it hit the skids with Bischoff as Crockett and Hogan as Rhodes does have some eerie similarities. There is also the theory that every time WCW builds the entire television show around the NWO as the base of the show as opposed to NWO being the outside force in the show, its ratings go right in the toilet. Under any circumstances, 1 week can be an aberration and numbers were tied on May 25th and it's probably 2 weeks early before jumping into any real judgments on the landscape. But there is no question that the issue of which group Sting would wind up in was one that the casual fan didn't care about. The only quarter hour which was close was the final quarter of Nitro, which built up to Sting's decision on which of the three factions to choose. He chose NWO Wolfpack, and a main event with Hulk Hogan and the Giant versus Randy Savage and Kevin Nash, which drew a 4.31 rating in 3,157,000 homes, while Raw, with The Undertaker vs. Kane main event with both Steve Austin and Vince McMahon at ringside, drew a 4.43 rating or 3,259,000 homes. Raw actually went 3 minutes past the hour and drew a 5.23 for that short overrun. The biggest gap was in the third quarter when WWF drew a 4.6 for the Undertaker/MC Mahan confrontation, while WCW drew a 3.1 for an interview with Curt Hennig and Rick Rude. WCW's peak was the final quarter hour. Well, actually its peak was in the first hour during the Raven and Saturn vs. Public Enemy match, doing a 4.4. But that's with no competition. WCW again peaked early, with the elimination match with DX vs. The Nation doing a 4.8 in the fifth quarter, while WCW did a 3.3 for Chris Jericho vs. Juventud Guerrera, before having a huge decline to 4.1 for Jeff Jarrett vs. Farouk, and slowly working back to the final 4.4. For May 25th, Raw did a 4.221 rating, 4.13 first hour, 4.31 seconds hour, and 6.86 share in 3,105,500 homes, while Nitro did a 4.196, 4.14 first hour, 4.19 seconds hour, 4.25 third hour, and 7.10 share in 3,072,000 homes. However, in the head-to-head period, Nitro did a 4.222 and a 6.89 share in 3,091,500 homes. The reason Raw actually had slightly more viewers while Nitro had a 1,000th of a rating point win head-to-head is because USA Network is in slightly more homes than TNT, and the slightage in share is because the live Nitro does air 3 hours earlier on the West Coast, so even though nobody ever talked about it after Nitro was winning the race every week, Raw has a very slight advantage nationwide when it comes to drawing ratings because of being in prime time on the West Coast, although Nitro over the second 2 hours has its own edge of having its first hour as a lead-in, so really the edges offset each other anyway. Each company won 4 quarters, with WCW catching up overall in the final quarter when Sting and Luger vs. NWO. Sting and Giant did a 5.0 rating to the teased but non-existent Austin vs. Undertaker match on Raw that did a 4.0 rating. Nitro peaked at the end, as it's supposed to, while Raw once again peaked early with a 4.7 rating for Taka Michinoku vs. Dick Togo, a DX taped segment, and the Marrow and Sable Soap and match with Farouk, while WCW did a 3.9 for Goldberg vs. Johnny Attitude. WWF hit a huge decline to a 4.0 for the Triple H's covert spy mission on WCW, which probably explains the end of that angle, and WCW went up to a 4.2 for Benoit vs. Booker T. Another point that should be noted is that WCW's best wrestling match on Nitro in months, and the most exciting segment of the show, the Guerrera vs. Billy Kidman, did a 4.0 rating, while the Jackal segment with the guys from Howard Stern and the Terrible Golda match, considered as the worst segment on the Raw show that same night, head-to-head did a 4.4. Whatever the reason, Raw is always peaking early and losing its audience before its climax, which I attribute to the overexposure of its key characters, McMahon and Austin, where by the time the big angle comes, people have seen them so much they are ready for something else. Evidently WWF believes that as well, because this past week Austin was really toned down on television, and reports we have are that while this week's TV had McMahon everywhere and one big, they recognize that McMahon is also getting too much television time to not burn him out over the long haul if they continue this direction. The WWF's Over the Edge pay-per-view on May 31st from Milwaukee just continued the same pattern of most of the group's recent pay-per-view shows, only taken to the extreme. Taken to the extreme is not a figure of speech regarding copying ECW, but a figure of speech regarding the typical pattern of having a really good main event and a weak undercard. In this case, the undercard was far worse than the usual week standards, topped off, or bottomed off more accurately, by the saddest angle of the year. And in this case, the main event with Steve Austin vs. Dude Love was possibly the best match so far this year in the United States, which, while it was a great match, also points out in bold letters just how weak this year has been when it comes to producing off-the-page matches. The WWF has been surviving on this formula not only for the past few years, but on and off since the formation of the company, where, not as much when it came to match quality, which wasn't really a concern in the past, but fan interest, the cards historically were built more like big boxing shows, where most of the hype was generated around the big title match and the undercard was largely thrown together. Today, you can't get away with throwing together undercards because the public doesn't react well to cold issues, but if there was one feeling coming out of the card, it was similar to watching ECW and seeing a product exposed when being taken out of its element of, in ECW's case, carefully produced and edited television, and in WWF's case, lengthy interviews and soap opera storylines, and in both cases, having the wrestlers have to actually go in the ring and produce matches of 10 minutes in length. All of a sudden, the red-hot WWF product was exposed before a sellout of 9,822 fans paying $186,383 and another $93,672 in merchandise. No, the most important entity, Steve Austin, is no fraud, and he and Dude Love put on an excellent brawl, heavily booked but not overbooked, to divert from the actual minimal amount of in-ring wrestling. It was the Raven vs. Diamond Dallas Page feud, with broken down cars instead of haystacks, and the Three Musketeers instead of the flock, but clearly a step above in quality. But what everyone knows to begin with became more obvious: the current success of the WWF is a pyramid balancing on its head the head of Austin. It's not the first time a company has been built around one wrestler, and it won't be the last, but it's precarious when the wrestler involved is working in an era where injuries are frequent, and he's working on more than his fair share of them. And he's not exactly playing patty cake out there like Hulk Hogan did, and still does, to where the risk of a future major injury really isn't that great. While a lot of guys and nobody more than DX, are over like crazy doing interviews and ring introductions and delivering cool catchphrases. It was painfully obvious that the fans in Milwaukee didn't care about seeing them wrestle after a few minutes. And having to do a lengthy match also exposed that in the ring when the catchphrases end, they are all three the same wrestlers that couldn't get over until they were put in a position to have a cool ring entrance. Even the Legion of Doom in their old stomping grounds got the expected big reaction coming out, but nobody actually wanted to see them wrestle, and if they don't want to see them wrestle a match in Milwaukee, sort of like when Kurt Hennig worked the Nitro in Minneapolis to no crowd reaction, where would they want to? Hey, except for Austin, the only other wrestler on the card who was really over in the building in a major way was the Crusher, now 71, who was the biggest drawing card in Milwaukee from the 60s through the early 80s. And unfortunately, in the worst moment of the show, instead of having Crusher and longtime cohort Mad Dog Vachon stand and take a bow for all the years of service to the business, they decided to book them in one, hopefully, last angle with willing foil Jerry Lawler, which unfortunately for the Milwaukee fans who grew up with Crusher, will leave them with one final memory of the man that they'll wish they never saw. Farouk vs. Rocky Maivia was a disaster of a storyline, which left the crowd dead, and even Mark Merrow vs. Sable came off totally flat. And even when WWF has good workers for the undercard, such as the Kaientai group, the bookers under the guise of making things more entertaining put them in a position to where what they do is anything but entertaining. Was it a good show? Depends upon your point of view. If you buy shows for the main event, how could you be disappointed? If you buy shows for 3 hours of bell-to-bell entertainment, how could you not be? Preliminary estimates are that the show did in 0.65 buy rate, which would be about 225,000 buys and a $2.90 million company gross, which is a great number for an in-your-house based on last year's standards, but a surprisingly big decline of approximately 31% from last month's Unforgiven show on buys and revenue with the same main event which did the surprisingly big number. It just goes to show that nothing is predictable. Some would say the difference was going up against the 7th game of the Bulls-Pacers series, but wrestling pay-per-view shows have gone head-up in the past against both the 7th game of the NBA Finals and the 7th game of the World Series without being any worse for wear, and wrestling fans could have always bought the replay show if they wanted to see the basketball game, so that explanation doesn't really wash. Last month both the McMahon angle and pro wrestling overall were hotter judging from the buy rate and the television viewing audience overall. However, during most of the period leading up to this show, WWF had Monday Night to itself and drew the 3 largest ratings in company history in the build-up to this show. 1. Legion of Doom 2000, Mike Hegstrand and Joe Laurinaitis, beat Skull and 8-Ball, Ron and Don Harris, in 9:56. Chains was in the corner of Skull and 8-Ball while Sonny was back with LOD, who also had Darren Drostoff in their corner. They seemed to tone down Drostoff's name as Puke, although they didn't drop the Puke name altogether, but emphasized his name as Drostoff and in the graphic called his Dros instead of Puke. I guess they didn't want to make subliminal suggestions by using the word puke too often while this match was going on. They did try, but the crowd wasn't into it, and they aren't very good, which doesn't help. The idea was for Sonny to bring life to the LOD, but the end result seems more to be that they are sucking the life from her, which is almost amazing when you put out someone who looks like that, dressed like that in front of today's early 20s wrestling audience, and she can't even arouse their interest once the match starts. Animal did the slowest drag and screw and recorded wrestling history early. DOA were more aggressive than usual. Hawk missed a clothesline off the top and rolled to the floor where Chains attacked him. Drostoff then attacked Chains. The twins worked on Hawk until Animal hot tagged in. 8-Ball pulled the switch to tease the television finish, but Drostoff clotheslined him in the back from the apron and he staggered into Animal's power slam for the pin. Based on the response, it appeared most people hated this match a lot more than I did. 1/2 of 1 star. Rocky Maivia came out for an interview, but Farouk did a run-in and they began brawling. Maivia tried to hit Farouk with a chair but instead hit the ropes and the chair rebounded in his own face and knocked him out. Farouk was then supposed to pile-drive Maivia on the chair, but the chair had a mind of its own and apparently got up and walked away, or something. Anyway, the pile-driver missed the chair by a mile. Since the plan was for Maivia to do a stretcher job and get a serious injury, on a spot that was totally missed, especially since Maivia was just fine was being given this incredible pile-driver on the ramp on television just last week, the announcers were put in a terrible position. Jim Ross called it as a pile-driver on the chair, trying to sell the storyline. Jerry Lawler said he thought the pile-driver missed the chair. They never showed a replay. Maivia still did the stretcher job. Later in the show it was announced that Sergeant Slaughter was ordering Maivia to defend the title or forfeit it, which was weird because it put Maivia in the babyface position. I guess this idea was to wind up as a story for Maivia to get the knee surgery since he was performing with a sprained knee but had a small piece of his patella broken off. Basically floating bone chips that would need to be surgically removed, with surgery scheduled for June 3rd. As it turns out, whatever the idea was to explain his absence was totally dropped, as this entire angle, the subsequent match and post-match injury, and even the knee injury itself, was never acknowledged the next night on television. 2. Jeff Jarrett pinned Steve Blackman in 10:18. Despite the elaborate ring entrance, Jarrett just doesn't get over. Match was marred by a lack of heat and missed spots, although occasionally when Blackman timed a kick right, it woke you back up into paying attention. Al Snow was in the Spanish-language announcer's booth with the Heat wearing a sombrero before security took him away. Probably the highlight was when Blackman moved, Jarrett nearly hit Tennessee Lee, and Blackman got him from behind in a great Japanese rolling crotch hold. Jarrett brought in one of Blackman's sticks, but Blackman got it away and used it on him and went for the pin, but Lee put Jarrett's foot on the ropes. Blackman then went to the top rope, but Lee hit Blackman with a stick and he fell off and was pinned. The finish only served to make Blackman look like an idiot, since he, as the babyface, lost to basically the same spot that the heel didn't lose to. 1/2 of 1 star. 3. Mark Mero pinned Sable, Rena Mero, in 21 seconds. This was billed as Sable having a mystery wrestler to face Mero, and if Sable's wrestler won, she'd get her freedom. If Mero won, Sable would have to leave the WWF forever. Sable said she wanted to take the match herself. Mero then got all apologetic to Sable about their past relationship and blamed the wrestling business for ruining their relationship. Now that wouldn't exactly be a first. Mero said he was sorry and laid down to let Sable pin him to get her freedom, but when she covered him, he reversed her and held her down for the 3 count. The crowd didn't react at all to this. Sable tried to cry doing an interview, but she just isn't very good as an actress, and they tried to make a big deal of her having to leave and showing her taking her bags and leaving the building for the last time. A blind man could see where this angle is going. 4. Dick Togo, Shigeki Sato and Men's Teo Takeo Otsuka, and Shoichi Funaki, beat Takamichi Noku, Takao Yoshida, and Bradshaw, John Leafield, in an unannounced 3-on-2 match in 9:54. This was easily the second best match on the show, but also had no crowd heat and was impossible to take as any kind of a match because of the size difference with Bradshaw to begin with, and how the size difference was played up, making the Japanese heels look like midget comedy figures, which made the match nothing compared to the level these guys work at in Japan, which could have been duplicated in the US despite closed minds. See ECW Barely Legal for proof of that. Apparently it wasn't completely decided about adding this match to the show until the day of the event, and my belief is they realized how weak the undercard was going to be and having to shorten 2 of the matches due to injuries, and that left an opening in the show, and the Japanese guys can work. Taka worked almost the entire match, and when Bradshaw would tag in, the Japanese would run away. At one point Teo did a pescado on Bradshaw, but he caught it like tea was nothing. Taka then hit Funaki outside the ring with a moonsault off the ropes to the floor. Togo's wrestling was good, with one of the quickest turning power slams since the prime of Buzz Sawyer. Bradshaw finally made the hot tag and destroyed the Kayanta guys, including a powerbomb on Funaki until Togo hit him with a low blow. Bradshaw recovered to give Teo a tiger suplex. Taka finally hit the Michinoku driver 2 on Togo, but Teo made the save and used his choke slam on Taka. Togo then pinned Taka after a high senton bomb. Somewhere during the match Teo injured his back and he couldn't wrestle the next night at television. 2.5 stars. 5. Rocky Maivia, Dwayne Johnson, pinned Farouk, Ron Simmons, in 5:02 to retain the IC title. Maivia was introduced twice and never came out. Finally Sergeant Slaughter came out and gave Maivia a 10 count to get to the ring or he'd forfeit his title, which immediately should have put him as the face. It didn't matter because the psychology of this was already completely screwed up. Maivia came out with the belt in a neck brace. Farouk then attacked Maivia, took off his neck brace and began hitting him. At that point this match made as much sense as the recent Shane Douglas vs. Al Snow match, except it was far worse. They worked the match with Maivia no longer selling the neck injury that was supposedly so disabling. The crowd had no clue how to react because even though Maivia was put in the face position, they didn't dislike Farouk, but could have cared less about him, and didn't like Rocky. Again no heat. Farouk then scored a pin out of nowhere with the ref counting 3 but Maivia getting his foot on the ropes. The spot should have been a big pop for the title change but nobody cared. Ref Tim White saw the foot on the ropes and restarted, and Maivia immediately took Farouk down with a leg dive and with both feet on the middle ropes, pinned him. Again no reaction. The fact Farouk couldn't beat a dead Maivia forced into the ring only served to kill his standing, and the two piledrivers after the match he gave Maivia drew no reaction either. Finally Owen Hart and the rest of the nation made the save, and DX then did a run-in to save Farouk. DX run-in got a reaction, but it was clear by this point nobody cared about Farouk. 1 star. 6. Kane, Glenn Jacobs, pin Vader, Leon White, in a mascara contra mascara match in 720. Vader was working this match with a pulled hamstring. He had noticeably dropped some weight since his TV appearance taped 2 weeks earlier. But the two didn't work together well at all. They tried to act as if nobody had ever seen Vader without a mask on before, and they'd get a chance to see him unmasked if he lost. Earl Hebner was back as referee for this match. Finally Vader hit a hard clothesline and missed a moonsault. Kane used the tombstone piledriver for the pin. Match had no heat. Vader unmasked, and then did an interview saying that he was nothing but a fat piece of shit who had just gotten his butt whipped and was nearly crying. Dud. If that wasn't bad enough, what should have been one of the best parts of the show turned into the worst. Mad Dog Vachon, who is very barely mobile with an artificial leg, was nearly carried into the ring, and came out with a Crusher, a native of Milwaukee who was the biggest single drawing card in the history of pro wrestling in the city, known throughout the years as the wrestler who made Milwaukee famous with his trademark cigar in his mouth like his old 50s street thug character. Crusher got the expected huge reaction. Michael Cole brought up all the AWA singles and tag team title reigns both men had it and brought up Crusher's famous tag team with Dick the Bruiser. Lawler acted as if he had never even heard of them, even to the point of asking which one was Crusher and which one was Mad Dog. Vachon grabbed the mic and said that people ask about his daughter wrestling, Luna, but that it's not his daughter but his niece, but he loved her like a daughter and she does a great job, and then thanked Vince McMahon for taking wrestling to a worldwide stage. Lawler hit the ring and Crusher protected Mad Dog and hit Lawler with the single most pathetic bolo punch in history, which is saying something if you ever saw Crusher wrestler in the 70s and 80s, because as over as he was from his name, his work made Roddy Piper look like he's Kenta Kobashi. But it got a huge pop as people wanted to Crusher do one last bolo punch. Lawler barely sold Crusher's big move, but then again, it would have had no credibility had he sold it, although Lawler has sold things with far less credibility in the past. It would have been great for the people live if it has just ended there. But then Lawler jumped in the ring to take Mad Dog's artificial leg off, and apparently as comedy, Lawler actually went for the good leg first, and Crusher chased him away again, but unfortunately then it became obvious Crusher couldn't move at all. At this point Lawler took off his robe, and he's really looking unathletic these days, and Crusher, who looked fine in a shirt, took off his shirt. That got no pop and was really sad because all those fans in Milwaukee probably remember Crusher as their powerhouse since for his time he was that, and instead reality struck with his shirt off and he looked no different than any other 71-year-old man. God help us if 45 years from now wrestling promoters bring Sunny back for one last angle and have her don a small bikini. It was already dead by this point, but I guess they had to finish the mess they started. Any fan in the building who is older than maybe 25 in that city probably has fond memories of Crusher as this immovable block of granite, and those who were in their 50s probably actually saw him at a time when he really was a powerhouse. And to see Lawler running away from this broken down man who couldn't move, couldn't even fool an audience desperately wanting to be fooled. The skit ended with Crusher hitting Lawler with Mad Dog's artificial leg, which may have been a big deal since everyone remembered what happened when Kevin Nash and Shawn Michaels traded using it in their match. It's a big deal because, as mentioned before, the last memory of Crusher that any of these fans will ever see is of this crippled old man unable to move taking off his shirt rather than a memory of this grizzled old powerhouse. It was bad enough seeing Muhammad Ali at the Inoki show, but at least New Japan had enough sense not to try and put him in an angle. People love to see their childhood heroes at autograph sessions, but nobody wants to see Ted Williams come up to bat today at a baseball game and have a pitcher lob in pitches and see that one of the greatest hitters who ever lived couldn't hit one past the infield. They'd cheer his feeble hit at the game, but almost cry if they were old enough to remember his prime when they went home. 7. Owen Hart and Kama Mustafa, Charles Wright, and D'Lo Brown, A.C. Connor, beat Hunter Hearst Helmsley, Paul Levesque, and Jesse James, Brian James and Billy Gunn, Monty Sopp, in 1833. Lawler cracked a funny line about Crusher and Mad Dog wrestling on the undercard of the David vs. Goliath match, and joked about having splinters in his forehead. A disappointing match with the exception of the performance of Hart, who was good, and Brown, who was good in spots. Helmsley was the only wrestler the crowd reacted to as a star once the match started, although DX got a huge reaction for their ring intros and entrance. Jim Ross tried to emphasize the youth in the WWF saying D'Lo is in his early 20s, I've got him listed as 29, although that could be wrong. And James in his 20s, he's 32. The crowd started a boring chant about 13 minutes in. Brown used a totally cool version of a power bomb. Who Ross said was a McDonald's high school All-American basketball player who once scored 67 points in a game. I actually remember him from high school as we're the same age and grew up in the same city, and he was a local basketball star. But I believe he was equivalent of an all-county player. But he was far from an All-American, and he was definitely not the star that Kurt Rambis or Ron Race were. And the fact he never played in college should tell you about any serious All-American credentials. Anyway, after a boring match, they had a pretty good finish, with China getting involved and attacking poor Mark Henry. Brown got Spike pile-driven on a tag title belt by Triple H and Gunn but was saved. Hart then used Helmsley's own pedigree on him on the title belt and got the pin. 1.5 star. 8. Steve Austin, Stephen Williams, retained the WWF title beating Dude Love, Michael Foley, in 22-28 with Vince McMahon as referee, Gerald Briscoe as timekeeper, and Pat Patterson as ring announcer. The ring introductions took forever, but were great in a campy bad way, especially compared to what took place earlier. Howard Finkel first introduced Patterson, claiming he was a Canadian hero along the lines of Wayne Gretzky, Gordie Howe, and Anne Murray, talked about his winning the Intercontinental title in a grueling tournament in Rio de Janeiro, whereupon Jim Ross said, "Wink, wink," and said he was a great role model for children. Patterson then introduced Briscoe, plugging his body shop in Tampa with the address and phone number and even the motto, and said he would be the first Native American to be inducted in the WWF Hall of Fame. There was even a line about Jay Strongbow, who of course wasn't really a Native American, and called him the reincarnation of Jim Thorpe. Then he introduced Vince McMahon, who was strutting around with his Mill mascaras at 50 walk and flexing his arms. Patterson refused to even announce Austin's name. Before the match started, Undertaker came out as Austin's guy to watch to make sure McMahon officiated the match fairly. The crowd was going nuts for almost every spot. The one spot that didn't get a reaction was when Austin stomped on Love's false teeth. Geez, Eddie Graham and the great Malenko built an entire industry in Florida around that spot in the 60s, and 3 decades later it's not even good for a pop. Dude was hung choking in the ropes. Love was hip-tossed onto the Spanish announcer's table. I don't think there's any question the most dangerous job in this profession is to be a Spanish-language announcer on the WWF pay-per-view events. Well, second most dangerous? The most dangerous is to be the table. Patterson then announced it was a no DQ match, which wasn't the announced plans, to show they're changing the match as it went along. Love took a bump on the timekeeper's table, wiping out Briscoe, and took a sick clothesline while sitting on the guardrail onto the floor. Austin was walking on Briscoe. Love came back with a neckbreaker on the floor, and at that point Patterson announced it was a Falls Count Anywhere match. Austin came back with a wind sprint clothesline. Love backdropped Austin onto the hood of one of the broken down cars set up for no reason in the aisle, with Austin's boots kicking in the windshield. Austin used a hot shot on the car for a near fall. Austin attempted a stunner on the roof of a car, but Love knocked him off. Love did a sunset flip off the roof to the floor. Dude got a lead pipe and hit Austin in the back of the head with it, and Austin came up having bladed himself on the forehead all bloody. Love used a suplex on the floor, and McMahon, who was doing the act of doing fair counts for both men because Undertaker was always watching him, but heavily rooting for Love, wanted Love to do the pin, but instead Love wanted to drop the elbow off the car. Austin moved, although Love thankfully protected himself more than usual, landing feet first on the bump. Austin whipped Love into the steps. While both were in the ring, Patterson tripped Austin. Love undid the padding on a turnbuckle and rammed Austin into the exposed metal for a near fall. McMahon then called for a chair, and Patterson gave Love a chair, and Love hit Austin in the back with a chair and used his double-arm DDT on the chair, but Austin kicked out. Love ran in running with a chair, but Austin got hit foot up, and Dude took the shot hard in the face. After a hard clothesline, Austin got the chair and delivered a sick chair shot to he face. McMahon, for the first time, just stood there and refused to count as Austin had Love pinned. As Austin got up and started yelling at McMahon, Love got up and tried to deliver another chair shot, but Austin moved, and just like last month, McMahon was knocked out by a hard chair shot. Austin used the stunner, but McMahon was KO'd and couldn't count the fall. Hey, he deserved the siesta because he'd worked his ass off up to that point, and that's not meant as facetious. Ref Mike C. Iota ran in, and at the count of 2, Patterson pulled him out of the ring and decked him. Love then put the mandible claw on Austin, and Patterson jumped in to make the 3 count, but Undertaker pulled Patterson out of the ring and choke-slammed him, at 58 years old, with Patterson kicking his feet way up to get even more of an affect from the move, to the American announcer's table. Briscoe then jumped in, and the same thing happened to him through the Spanish announcer's table. Austin then got out of the claw and delivered another stunner, and while covering Love, grabbed McMahon's hand and counted to 3, and the bell rang signifying that he won. 4.5 stars. Koji Kanemoto faces Dr. Wagner Jr. on June 3 in Osaka in the finals of the annual New Japan Top of the Super Junior tournament. The surprising final matching up two wrestlers who have never won the tournament in the past is a result of both wrestlers finishing the round-robin aspect of the tournament with 4-1 records and capturing their block. Wagner, whose lone loss was to Jushin Liger, picked up what would have to be considered 3 upset wins over El Samurai, Shinjiro Otani and Tatsuhito Takaiwa, along with a win over Masakazu Fukuda to reach the finals. The tournament came down to a singles match with Wagner and Samurai on June 1 in Ogaki, with Wagner scoring a surprising pin in 14-16 using the Michinoku Driver 2. Kanemoto met Shiryu, Kaz Hayashi of WCW, on May 31 in Tottori in a match to determine who would win the B grouping, with Kanemoto winning with a Tiger Suplex in 16:52. Kanemoto lost to Yuji Yasurioka in his first tournament match, before coming back with wins over Kendo Kashin, Hayato Nanjo and Felino before the match with Shiryu. It is Wagner's first championship match in New Japan, while the tournament seems to establish Kanemoto, who is the heavy favorite to beat Wagner, as Liger's new top contender for the IWGP Junior Heavyweight title. Kanemoto went to the finals last year for the first time, losing to Samurai in what was a strong match of the year candidate and is still generally considered Kanemoto's career best performance. The final standings in the A block behind Wagner were Liger and Samurai at 3-2, Otani and Takaiwa at 2-3 and Fukuda at 1-4. In the B block behind Kanemoto were Shiryu and Kashin at 3-2, Felino and Nanjo at 2-3 and Yasurioka at 1-4. Japanese television rundown. May 16, New Japan. 1. Jushin Liger and Kendo Kashin and El Samurai beat Tatsuhito Takaiwa and Koji Kanemoto and Shinjiro Otani in 1806. The final 8 minutes aired on television, and it was the typical real good match between these 6. Kanemoto kicked out of a Super Fisherman Buster from Liger in the highlight of the match. After several near falls by Kanemoto on Liger, Liger scored the pin with a running Liger bomb. 3.5 stars. 2. Hiroyoshi Tenzan beat Osamu Nishimura in 1743. Only 5 minutes aired on television, and what aired was really good. Basically, it was typical Japanese storyline with Nishimura getting near fall after near fall, using 2 missile drop kicks, a Northern Lights suplex, rolling reverse cradle with a back bridge, backslide, small package, lateral guillotine, an abdominal stretch, known in Japan as the Cobra Twist, before finally Tenzan clamped on a form of a cobra to get the submission. People have been into Nishimura a lot more of late. 3.5 stars. 3. Tatsumi Fujinami and Shinya Hashimoto beat Masahiro Chono and Big Titan in 9:44 when Hashimoto pinned Chono. Bad. After the match, Hashimoto challenged Fujinami for the title match. 1/2 star. 4. Genichiro Tenryu and Michiyoshi Ohara and Shiro Koshinaka beat Manabu Nakanishi and Satoshi Kojima and Kensuke Sasaki in 25:51. Another of what has been typical of New Japan television for the past several months, in that the matches that look to be boring on paper end up being really exciting. Once again, it was Kojima's work that carried the bout. Ohara and Koshinaka stuffed pile drove high on the floor and he was worked over. The crowd really popped when Sasaki was in with Tenryu, as they are 2 big stars who have had very little ring time against each other in their careers. Tenryu's work at 48 continued to be a big surprise. Match showed with them working on Sasaki to get heat for Kojima's hot tag, and the match picked up big at that point. Stiff, Kojima was triple power bombed off the middle ropes and Koshinaka hit a power bomb for a near fall, but Kojima came back with a diamond cutter for a near fall. Nakanishi was rarely in, but he finally tagged in and used the rack twice on Ohara but couldn't put him away. Nakanishi was finally put away when Tenryu gave him an Enzui-jiri from outside the ring. Ohara hit him with a flying clothesline. Tenryu got a near fall with a lariat, then Tenryu and Koshinaka did a sandwich Enzui-jiri, and finally Tenryu dropped the elbow off the top rope on him and pinned him after a powerbomb. 3.5 stars. May 23, New Japan. 1. Shiryu pinned Felino in a Super Juniors tournament match in 10:19. Shiryu took his mask off as he got in the ring and the announcer said his name was Kaz Hayashi, but then called him Shiryu for the rest of the match. It was kind of weird but good match. Shiryu did a dive over the top rope and a great flying Hurricane Rana off the top rope, which was every bit as good as a Rey Mysterio Jr. version. 3.25 stars. 2. Takaiwa pinned Liger in 15:03 in a tournament match. About 10 minutes aired on television. It was very good, although not the best match these two could have. Takaiwa did his regular spots such as the Death Valley Driver and the Triple Bomb. Liger got a lot of near falls as well, including the Super Fisherman Buster and all the palm blows. Takaiwa blocked a palm blow and came back with a lariat, a rabbit lariat, clothesline to the back of the head, and another lariat for the pin. 3.5 stars. 3. Tenzan and Titan and Chono beat Koshinaka and Ohara and Goto in 11:30. The last 7 minutes aired on television. It was bad. Goto and Ohara were wearing new outfits with their new team name as the Stray Dogs. With Goto and Titan in the same match, the rest couldn't save it. Finish saw Chono use the STF to get a submission from Goto, while at the same time Tenzan used the Cobra on Ohara, and Titan and Koshinaka were fighting outside the ring. Chono's team still comes out to the NWO ring music before Chono's music plays. After the match, Kojima and Nakanishi did a run-in attacking Chono and Tenzan, but then the Stray Dogs got up and attacked Kojima and Nakanishi, who actually made the save for them to start up a three-way program as they teased the tournament for the tag titles. 1 star. 4. Fujinami and Sasaki beat Hashimoto and Nishimura in 15:40. The final 9 minutes aired on television. Most of the focus was Sasaki versus Nishimura, and it went nowhere, and they missed spots, and it almost fell apart in a manner rarely seen in New Japan rings. Fujinami and Hashimoto were rarely in, but when they were in together to build up their IWGP Heavyweight title match on June 5th. Whenever they were in, Hashimoto beat the hell out of Fujinami and gave Fujinami no offense at all. They definitely are building the title matches to where it's a given Hashimoto is going to win, and usually when something is built in that manner, the opposite ends up taking place. Hashimoto had Fujinami and a cross armbreaker on the floor, while in the ring Sasaki pinned Nishimura with a lariat. Fujinami had to be helped from ringside. Weak for a New Japan main event, even with the storyline, as Hashimoto was the only one of the four who looked decent. 1.25 stars. Mexico. It now appears that Promo Azteca hasn't completely folded, and talk is they'll be back on television in late June or early July after the World Cup. Thus far, Black Magic, La Parka, Super Parka and Lizmark Sr. have jumped to EMLL. Lizmark Jr., Hector Garza, who is out of action with a knee injury, and Pierre Roth Jr. have all to this point turned down offers to jump. EMLL has its anniversary show on June 5th at Arena Mexico with a pretty weak lineup for its traditional big show of the year, headlined by Steel Val Venice versus Rayo de Jalisco Jr. in a mask versus mask match, with everyone in the world knowing how that one is going to turn out. Also Atlantis and Headhunters versus Cien Caras and Apollo Dantes and Bestia Salvaje, Negro Casas and Shocker and Mr. Aguila versus El Satanico and Black Warrior and El Hijo del Santo, so it's really just like any other Friday except for the main event. AAA has its first Triple Mania on June 7th in Chihuahua with Heavy Metal versus Kickboxer in a street fight in a cage with the hair of Ref Pepe Casas, Metal's father, and Tirantes at stake depending upon who loses. Plus Fuerza Guerrera and New Mosco de la Merced defend the Mexican national tag titles against Pero Aguayo and Pero Aguayo Jr., a lumberjack match with Latin Lover and La Parca Jr., Mascara Sagrada Jr. and Blue Demon Jr. versus AAA Psicosis and Cibernetico and AAA Hysteria, and Maniaco and Octagon, Octagonchito and Pentagon versus Abismo Negro and Mini Abismo Negro and Electroshock. Fray Tormenta, who gained a lot of fame and publicity, particularly in the United States with his gimmick of being a priest who wrestles to help fund an orphanage, unmasked this past week largely to set up the introduction of a Fray Tormenta Jr. taking his mask. The May 29th Arena Mexico main event had Brazo de Plata beating Gran Marcus Jr. in their hair versus hair match. What we're told about Arena Mexico of late is that it's similar to All Japan, different style of course, and that it's a traditional old-style promotion with a lot of good wrestling but little in the way of gimmicks, and the angles are all outdated traditional stuff as compared to the wilder AAA. Some of the young wrestlers such as Brandon, Olympico and Oriental are said to be pretty good. Next Tijuana is June 7th at the Auditorio promoted by CMLL with Universo 2000 defending his CMLL heavyweight title against Rayo de Jalisco Jr., Shocker and Tigre Blanco and Mascara Magica versus Negro Casas and Rey Mysterio and Karloff Lagarde Jr. and Thunderbird and Sueño Chicano versus Bestia Salvaje and Jacques Mate. Tigre Blanco is the wrestlers who used to be enter with a new gimmick. El Sendero in EMLL was the wrestler who was formerly Astro Rey Jr. Damien Cito, who used to wrestle as a mini, is now the Mexican lightweight champion. He was given the belt with the explanation he beat a wrestler called Akira in May in Guadalajara, but it was probably fictitious. Lady Warrior, who is the wife of Espectrito I, has returned after taking nearly 2 years off after having a child. The May 15th Arena Mexico show with the Parejas Increíbles rules with all the partners that feuded with each other during the tournament wound up with no winner. The final was Steel and Atlantis versus Rayo de Jalisco Jr. and Cien Caras, which ended with Steel and Rayo brawling outside to a double count-out as they are building to the mask versus mask match. The La Parka versus Pierroth Jr. mask versus mask match, which from an Impact standpoint should be the biggest match of the year in Mexico, is now scheduled for July 20th in Nuevo Laredo. Mr. Niebla is getting his knee scoped and should be out for about a month. All Japan. Mighty Inoue Sueyo Inoue, 49, announced his retirement and his ceremony will take place on the June 12th Budokan Hall show. Inoue actually hadn't wrestled for a few years but had never officially had a retirement ceremony. Known in his youth as the Japanese Edward Carpentier for using similar flying moves like somersaults, despite being a short, stocky guy, Inoue debuted on July 21, 1967 for the old International Wrestling Enterprises promotion facing Tsuyoshi Sendai, who's better known now as New Japan official Joe Daigo from Calgary. He wrestled with IWE until the promotion closed in 1981, when he, rather than joining with Rusher Kimura, Animal Hamaguchi and Osamu Teranishi in New Japan for what turned out to be a huge money short-term worked interpromotional feud with New Japan, went instead with All Japan, where as it turned out he made the right decision for long-term stability as he worked as a mid-carder for several years before finishing up working the heel side of the comedy match, ironically against Kimura, who ended up in All Japan after a jump in 1984. Kimura and Inoue were the top two stars of the 70s for IWE, which had an affiliation with the old AWA in the United States. Inoue, who was a short but pretty good worker for his era, was pushed all the way to the group top position when top star Shozo Strong Kobayashi jumped to New Japan in early 1974 for his famous match with Antonio Inoki, which was the predecessor for all the big money matches of the past 2 decades in Japan. His big push climaxed on August 16, 1974 when he pinned superstar Billy Graham to win the IWE International Heavyweight title. When he held the belt, it led to an IWE vs AWA World Title Unification match against Vern Gagne, which ended as a double count out. However, Inoue wasn't a big draw and the politics worked against him, and the office decided upon a change in plans, which began the era of Kimura as the top star of the group. On April 10, 1975 he dropped the title to Mad Dog Vachon, who was really just a transitional champion, to get the belt back on Kimura. He was then a perennial tag team champion, as he and Great Kusatsu held the IWA tag team titles on 3 occasions, and later formed a team with Animal Hamaguchi to hold the title 2 more times, including beating the New Japan duo in an interpromotional angle of Kantaro Hoshino and Kotetsu Yamamoto to win the belts in 1979 after the New Japan team came to IWE and captured their tag titles. Finally, Inoue and Ashura Hara won the belts from Paul Ellering and Terry Lathan on May 16, 1981 in Tokyo, and held it until the promotion folded. Hara and Inoue kept their tag team in All Japan, working mainly mid-cards, first capturing the All-Asian tag team titles that were vacant, beating Great Kojika and Motoshi Okuma on February 23, 1983 before losing when Inoue gave up the tag titles to focus on winning the old NWA International Junior Heavyweight title. Inoue and Takashi Ishikawa captured the vacant titles on October 31, 1985 before losing to Super Strong Machine, Junji Hirata, and Hara on October 30, 1986. After Machine jumped to New Japan, Inoue and Ishikawa beat Teranishi and Masanobu Kurisu to determine new champs on July 30, 1987 in Tokyo, before losing to the Footloose, and who would have thought that team would be back in the news in 1998, which was the team name of Toshiaki Kawada and Samson Fuyuki on March 9, 1988, stemming from an 80s movie. Inoue's biggest win in All Japan was capturing the International Junior Heavyweight title from Chavo Guerrero on February 26, 1984 in Osaka. It is believed Inoue will wind up working for All Japan as a referee. Lineup for June 12 at Budokan, which as you can see is really a one-match show, is Kentaro Shiga and Makoto Hashi vs Takeshi Morishima and Yoshinobu Kanemaru, Manukiya Mossman vs Satoru Asako for the PWF Junior title, Geto and Jado vs Yoshinari Ogawa and Tsuyoshi Kikuchi, Giant Baba and Kimura and Mitsuo Momota vs Masa Fuji and Eigen and Jun Izumida, Takao Mori and Masao Inoue vs Steve Williams, in his final match for All Japan, and Wolf Hockfield, David Heath and Giant Kimala 2 vs Johnny Ace and Johnny Smith, Bobby Duncombe Jr. vs Akira Taue, Jun Akiyama and Tamon Honda vs Gary Albright and Yoshihiro Takayama, and the Triple Crown with Kawada vs Kenta Kobashi. With Mitsuharu Misawa out of action, crowds on this tour have been poor, probably the worst drawing tour in years, and also very little storyline news. On May 31st in Funabashi, Smith and Hockfield retained the All-Asian Tag titles, beating Honda and Omori in 26-30. May 17th TV show only drew a 1.5 rating. New Japan. The biggest angle being pushed is a worked split between Antonio Inoki and New Japan. As the storyline goes, New Japan wants Naoya Ogawa to work the June 5th Budokan Hall show and also wrestle on their regular tour since he would help draw on the road. However, Inoki, who is supposedly in Ogawa's head, wants him to continue his martial arts training. It is now well known publicly that Ogawa has been training in Minnesota with Brad Rheingans, Don Fry and Brian Johnston, and the question is whether or not Fry and Johnston will join Inoki's UFO, or will Ogawa, who has the rivalry with Fry, help Yoshiaki Fujiwara, who faces Fry, and giving him Fry's weak points. Kanishiki, a 600-pound sumo wrestler who was a big-time celebrity in Japan, retired on May 30th at Sumo Hall before a huge television audience. The ceremony where sumos retire ends with them cutting their hair, and it's usually major celebrities that do so. One of Kanishiki's haircutters was Tatsumi Fujinami, as the two apparently became good friends nearly a decade ago at a time when both were at the top of their game and knocked out of action due to back injuries. Masahiro Chono said that he would be going to WCW in July once Keiji Muto returns. May 16th TV did a 2.5 rating. Other Japan notes. In a huge surprise, Bitshad Teriel, a 315-pound Russian karate fighter who was probably the worst worker in the entire company, captured the ring's world heavyweight title, beating Kiyoshi Tamura in 3:39 when the ref stopped the match due to Tamura's knee injury on May 29 in Sapporo before a disappointing crowd of just 3,200. Don't know what to make of the result, as on paper it makes no sense unless they are using Teriel as a transitional champion to put Tsuyoshi Kosaka over as the group's new top star after Tamura got hammered in the shoot last month. You wouldn't think they'd put Tamura in a shoot with him going in injured, as he waited way too long to tap last month to Valentin Overeem with the title at stake and in the main event, although rumor has it that is what it was and that Tamura's knee was bad going in and the ref had to stop it quickly. I'm skeptical. Kosaka beat Full Khan for the first time in his career in 10-10 with a choke, while Ilya Kine Mikhail beat 209-pound class champion Masayuki Naruse in a non-title match 10-52 with a leg lock. Akira Maeda was once again at the show talking about bringing rings to the United States. Maeda also said they haven't picked his final opponent for September, but said that he wasn't interested in his final match being against either Shinya Hashimoto, Genichiro Tenryu, or any big-name pro wrestler that he had never faced before. Kyoko Hamaguchi, the 20-year-old daughter of Animal Hamaguchi, captured her third consecutive Japanese Freestyle Wrestling Championship at 143 pounds on May 31st in Tokyo and qualified for the World Championships in September in Poland. Hamaguchi is the defending world champion. FMW ran a storyline all week to officially close down the Zen angle, which nobody believed and really went nowhere. It started with a 3-match series where Atsushi Onita would have to win all his matches for Zen to survive. First, on May 25th in Niage, Onita and Koji Nakagawa and Tetsuhiro Kuroda and Hideki Hasaka lost to Hiromichi Fuyuki and Haido and Yukihiro Kanemura and Jado when Nakagawa was pinned by Kanemura, which becomes important as the story unfolds. By virtue of the win, Fuyuki was allowed to pick a member of Zen to join Fuyuki Gun, and he picked Hasaka. Then on May 26th in Kumamoto, Fuyuki and Kanemura and Haido beat Onita and Nakagawa and Kuroda, and by the virtue of those stipulations, Fuyuki got to pick another member, and this time he picked Kuroda. On May 27th in Hakata, Fuyuki and Kanemura won the World Brass Knucks Tag titles, beating Hayabusa and Masato Tanaka in 1934 when Kanemura pinned Tanaka. After the match, Fuyuki said that he and Kanemura were forming a regular tag team called the Footloose. Wow, that's twice in the same issue, since he and Kawada were the original Footloose and in the ring issued a challenge to the Can-Am Express, Dan Crawford and Doug Furness, who were the Footloose's big tag team rivals around 1988 to 91 before Kawada became such a big star. They basically left Fuyuki in the dust. This all built to May 31st in Kanazawa and a captain's fall match, in which each team has a captain and the only way the match can end is one captain pinning the other, with the Footloose against Onita and Nakagawa and with Zen already destroyed. The gimmick was that if Onita lost, he'd have to leave FMW. Onita used his Thunderfire powerbomb on Fuyuki, but when Footloose manager Ito gave Nakagawa a 2x4 and he turned on Onita hitting him with it, and Fuyuki used Onita's own Thunderfire powerbomb on him to score the pin in 13:34. Nakagawa shook hands after the match with Ito and Footloose, and Fuyuki proclaimed that he did what nobody else could do and ran Onita out of FMW. He said he'd win the contracts of Hayabusa and Tanaka next and make FMW president Arai his personal gopher. After this was all done, Fuyuki at some point revealed that they had made the deal with Nakagawa back in March. It was Nakagawa working for Fuyuki all along who had caused Onita to lose several of his big matches. As the Japanese storyline goes, Onita, now banished from FMW, is going to work ECW, and he'll start up in late June and build to the first explosive barbed wire match ever in the US over the summer. Pancrase ran June 2nd at Korakuen Hall before a sellout 1,950 with Minoru Suzuki beating John LeBay via decision after 15 minutes in the main event. It was LeBay's first match since breaking his shin bone in December. Jason DeLucia retained his number 4 rating, beating Satoshi Hasegawa in 6:15 with a straight armbar when Leon Dyke knocked out Kyuma Kunyoku in 3:57. Pancrase's annual Neo Blood Tournament, which is a shooting tournament for the younger wrestlers, takes place on July 7th at Korakuen Hall. Mitsuhiro Matsunaga made his debut with a shoot-style Battlerts group on May 27th at Korakuen Hall, beating Katsumi Yujuda. It was the first time a wrestler had used tactics like biting and using foreign objects on a Battlerts show. Big Japan President Shinya Kojika had his 35th year anniversary match on May 31st in Sapporo, wrestling 6 different matches on the show, including 5 with a 2-minute time limit. Kojika at first lost to Ryuji Yamakawa and Genesu Kobayashi, before beating Yuichi Taniguchi and Tomoaki Homa all in less than 92 seconds, before going to a 2-minute draw with Minoru Fujita. Later in the main event he wrestled under a mask as the Masked DK, for Great Kojika, teaming with Shoji Nakamaki and Jason the Terrible to beat Great Pogo and Shadow Winger and Shadow WX. Michinoku has been running a singles tournament for the past several weeks, which ended on May 31st in Nihamatsu with Naohiro Hoshikawa beating Grand Naniwa in the finals. New Japan sent wrestlers to the May 31st War Show in Inaka and June 1st show at Korakuen Hall. The first night, Tadao Yasuda and Kendo Kashin beat Nobutaka Araya and Masaaki Mochizuki. At Korakuen, Jushin Liger beat Mochizuki and Araya beat Yasuda. Both shows drew poorly. All Japan Women will be holding its Grand Prix tournament from June 14th to August 9th, with a winner to get a shot at Shinobu Kondori's WWWA title. In the tourney will be Yumiko Hata, Manami Toyota, Takako Inoue, Kumiko Maikawa and the Masked Saps, which is the smallest Grand Prix ever, but then again there is no depth like in years past. They are also doing a Junior Grand Prix with the rest of the women, probably as a way to put over Momoe Nakanishi. The big matches are June 14th at Korakuen Hall with Hata vs Zap T and Inoue vs Zap I, June 20th in Sapporo Nakajima Sports Center with Hata vs Toyota, July 19th at Korakuen Hall with Zap I vs Zap T and Hata vs Inoue, July 26th in Sendai with Hata vs Zap T, August 4th in Yokohama with Hata vs Maikawa, and August 8th at Korakuen Hall with Maikawa vs Zap I and Toyota vs Zap T. There is also talk of a big show in Kawasaki in August with Kondori vs Toyota, which means Toyota will probably not win the tourney, so the tourney winner can get the title shot, the winner later in the year. Here and there. There was a tribute to former Charleston, South Carolina pro wrestling promoter Henry Marcus, who is 87, held on May 30th at the old King Street Palace where he used to promote. Among those who attended were Johnny Valentine, who everyone treated as the big celebrity in attendance, Ole Anderson, Tully Blanchard, Sandy Scott, Rip Hawk, Sweet Hansen, Thunderbolt Patterson, Tim Woods, Nelson Royal, Abe Jacobs, Jose Lothario, Burhead Jones, George Harris, Tommy Young, Ron West, Penny Banner, Mae Young, Fabulous Moolah and Diamond Lil, and there were some local indie matches refereed by Young, West and WCW refs Mark Curtis and Charles Robinson. It was said to be the first time Hawk and Hansen, who were famous tag team in the 60s and 70s in numerous territories, had seen each other in 17 years, and they were apparently attached to each other the whole time. About 650 fans attended, which was said to have been a disappointment. Burhead Jones was talking about a book he's written largely based on the fact that early in his career, he pinned Hulk Hogan when Hogan wrestled as Sterling Golden in Alabama. They announced the first major Memphis show for Memphis Power Pro on June 23rd at the Mid-South Coliseum, headlined by Jerry Lawler vs. Kane. They teased who Lawler's opponent would be throughout the show, and Lawler was joking about it, saying that it was a ratings tease because all wrestling today is about drawing television ratings, and again brought up that's why Randy Hales likes to have panty shots of Stacy, his girlfriend, on television, and even repeated the line about panties not being the greatest thing in the world, but they're next to it. which some thought was amazing on Saturday morning in such a strong religious area that Lawler would make that remark even though it's standard raw fare. Anyway, when Hales, who they are doing a gimmick where he's annoyed at Lawler for always making fun of him, announced Kane as his foe, Dizzy freaked out and slapped Hales as they went off the air. Lawler, also in reference to Tony Falk's sex life, said it was like shooting pool with a rope. Derek King is doing a gimmick where he's in love with Jacqueline, and also imitates a top wrestling star every week. Since he's in love with Jacqueline, this week he tried to be the Taskmaster with a lightning bolt on his forehead as the DK Master. Headbangers will be in June 12th and June 13th. The first combination religious testimony and pro wrestling show put on by Carl Wyman on May 23rd in Wheeling, West Virginia drew 1,050 fans at $5 per head, so it was a money loser and Wyman pulled out of the rest of the shows. Billy Graham, Ted DiBiase and Nikita Koloff were the main speakers while Meng, Jimmy Snuka, Robert Gibson, Hector and Eddie Guerrero all wrestled. With Wyman pulling out, Graham is basically putting together a June 12th show in Beaumont, Texas at the Montaigne Center headlined by Terry Funk vs. Cactus Jack in a Texas death match, plus Dustin Runnels, Honky Tonk Man, Meng, Snuka and Hector Guerrero will also appear. Jackie Fargo is confirmed as making a guest appearance on the Music City NWA 50th year anniversary show on June 6th in Nashville. Rex King and Stephen Dunn won the Music City tag titles on May 30th in Nashville, but after the match Dunn and Reno Riggins both attacked King to set up King and a mystery partner against Dunn and Riggins. Steve Nelson's USWF on June 20th in Amarillo has Evan Tanner, coming off a win in an Extreme Challenge MMA tournament, defending his heavyweight title against Tony Castillo, and Paul Jones defending his light heavyweight title against Billy Scott, a protege of Billy Robinson who wrestled for years in UWFI and Kingdom. Don Lewis show on June 24th in Marietta, Georgia at the Cobb County Civic Center has Dan Severn vs. the Patriot, Del Wilkes, for the NWA title, Rock and Roll Express vs. Vampire Warlock and Demon Hellstorm managed by Missy Hyatt, Duke Treese vs. Punk Rock Gaines, a tournament for the Texas title with Rex King, Recon Texas Ranger, Bulldog Reigns, Critical Mass, and Barry Windham, plus Abdullah the Butcher in a handicap match and scheduled appearances of Sid Vicious, Bob Armstrong, and Marlena. For more info call 404-231-5775. Rocky Maivia, Mark Henry and D'Lo Brown all appeared for Border City Wrestling on May 29th in LaSalle, ONT drawing 1,050. Maivia was supposed to defend the IC title against Scott D'Amore, but due to his knee injury, it was made a tag with Maivia protecting himself, teaming with Brown to beat D'Amore and Larry Brune. The A&E Wrestling Special is scheduled for a rebroadcast on June 14th and June 18th. Tully Blanchard vs. Buddy Landell headlines July 17th at Concord, NC Motorsports Park for New Dimension Wrestling plus Jimmy Snuka vs. Iron Sheik, Tony Atlas vs. One Man Gang and Bushwhackers vs. Bobby and Jackie Fulton, Rick Link vs. Abdullah the Butcher and Manny Fernandez vs. Willie Clay. July 18th at Skylands Park in Augusta, New Jersey has Tito Santana vs. Samu and Dominic DiNucci vs. Nikolai Volkov with Bruno Sammartino as referee plus Ufa works the show. Peach State Wrestling on June 13th in Cordell, Georgia has the final match of Ted Oates after a 26-year career against Dutch Mantell, who Oates had his first pro match against when Mantell used his real name of Wayne Keown in Americus, Georgia. The scheduled main event of Terry Gordy vs. Mike Golden has been changed to Golden vs. Tony Atlas, as Gordy got a booking the same night in Texas plus Abdullah the Butcher will be in a battle royal. If you mention the Observer you can get $1 off tickets. IPWA on June 13th in Alexandria, Louisiana at Secret Cove at Buddy Landell, Cue Ball Carmichael, and Jimmy Cicero. CWA has given up its traditional tournaments this year in Austria. The Graz tournament was cancelled because Austria qualified for the World Cup and the feeling is that nothing can compete with that, and they lost their building in Vienna and haven't found a new place. CWA will start its season on September 3rd in Hanover with its final show on December 20th in Bremen. A correction from last week on page 2 in describing Sid Audi. The word that should have been used was unprofessional, not professional. The Brian Pillman Show from Norwood, Ohio airs on June 14th on WBQC Channel 25. ESPN2 has been repeating the Old World's Strongest Man contests, and the one with Billy Graham from 1980 aired this past week. MMA. In what is without a doubt one of the strangest stories of the year, promotion called USWF, not to be confused with Steve Nelson's group with the same initials, has a show on June 12th in Pasadena, Texas scheduled with Becky Levi facing a supposed Mexican male pro wrestler named El Soberano on a card promoted by Silviera Guerra in what is supposed to be a shoot match. The main event on the show was scheduled as Dan Severn vs. Harry Moskowitz, a two-time UFC participant with a 2-5 record, but Moskowitz has pulled out over money differences. Guerra is billing his company as the Universal Shoot Wrestling Federation. Nelson's initials stand for Unified Shoot Wrestling Federation, so naturally that will cause confusion in the marketplace. However, the initials USWF have been used by other pro wrestling companies and also by the United States Wrestling Federation, which is a governing body of freestyle wrestling, so nobody can lay claim to those initials. Levi is taking the fight against an untrained male performer since she's had one fight after another canceled when her female opponents, who have often been very large former pro wrestlers, have canceled out with the realization of who it is they are going to face. However, this is a bad situation for the entire MMA world. If this match gets any publicity, somehow Nelson and perhaps UFC will be painted with the same brush as something of a freak show doing men versus women matches. Worse, if somehow Levi were to be injured in this match, it almost guarantees it'll get publicity. If Levi wins, what does it say about her opponent? If the match does take place, and there are governmental authorities working at stopping it, the repercussions will reflect badly on the Nelson promotion and Guy Mesger's Pancratian promotion in Texas. The government to this point has left alone, and the State Boxing Commission has had meetings and are trying to put together rules to allow these promotions to continue, which are basically the same rules as Pancrase in Japan. KRS has announced 2 more matches for its June 24th Pride show from Tokyo Budokan Hall. Former Kingdom Pro wrestler Shunsuke Matsui against Akira Shoji, who is best known for his 30-minute draw with Renzo Gracie at the October 9th Tokyo Dome show, and undefeated Mark Kerr, 8-0 against the Pedro Otavio, a well-known Brazilian luta livre fighter with a record of something like 15-3, who in Brazil defeated large national caliber American wrestler Brian Keck and is best known in Japan for beating Koji Kiao in a shoot match and losing to Keiji Muto in a worked match. The tentative plans for UFC is for the next live show to be October 9th from Brazil and another show on November 15th from Japan. Probably the October show would air on pay-per-view, likely on a tape delay. Because the shows are so far off, nothing even considered as strong preliminary lineups are being talked about, with the bigger problem how to get back on cable. It appears the most recent show did between 0.35 and 0.40 buy rate, which is what the shows have been doing for the most part of late. Real TV filmed a segment with Frank Shamrock on May 29th. Not sure when it'll air. The explanation from David Isaacs of Semaphore Entertainment Group in regard to the rules and the Tank Abbott match with Hugo Duarte at the pay-per-view is that it was simply a case of John McCarthy making a minor mistake in explaining the rules at the fighters' meeting before the show. Isaacs said that the fighters are given copies of the rules with their contracts. However, the rules the fighters have been led to believe are official due to last-minute change are the ones explained to them at the meeting before the show. Isaacs' belief is that once Abbott got in that position where he was behind Duarte, that he was going to win the fight. After an agreement between the promoters and the government of Quebec, the IFC was allowed to put on a show with the new rules as stated last week on May 30th at the Indian Reservation in Conowick. Nicholas Starks, who wrestled for Kingdom, won his first match in a heavyweight tournament but forfeited the championship match due to suffering an eye injury in his win. So Travis Fulton, who is 21 years old and has extensive EFC experience, including several matches with Jeremy Horn, won the tourney. And the main event, billed as for the IFC heavyweight title, Vladimir Matyushenko, the champion, a former member of the national wrestling team from Belarus who is now living in California and was a 2-time national junior college heavyweight champion in 1996 and 1997, beat former UFC and EFC fighter Anthony Macias in just 16 seconds and bloodying him badly with a punch to the face, and Macias saying that he didn't want to continue. Both the doctor and ref said that he could continue, but Macias himself refused to continue, which turned into something of a controversial ending. It was the first show with the new rules, and there was, as expected, a lot of confusion about the rules. While the grappling fanatics liked the show since 6 matches ended with submissions, most of the fans were looking for more striking, especially when it went to the ground. They're going to attempt to get the new laws reworked to allow at least some type of striking on the ground. Saw a tape of the Draka pay-per-view show. It had some entertaining fights, and the combination of takedowns with the standing striking probably would have more appeal to wrestling fans than kickboxing rules. Still, while this is a company that clearly has money behind it since it is paying big money and taking in no money, getting over a new hybrid sport like this in today's environment is a long shot at best. They never talked about a return date. The production standards weren't good, and the announcers, while knowledgeable about what they were talking about, weren't smooth in the least. I thought Maurice Smith beat Jean-Claude Luer in the main event billed for the Worldwide Draka Federation World Super Heavyweight title, even though two judges had it a draw and the other gave it 7-5 for Luer, so it was ruled a majority draw. Luer got a few big takedowns in the middle, but he was being hammered for the last 4 rounds and was nearly out in the 12th. Both Smith and Luer will appear on the K1 pay-per-view on August 7th, although not necessarily against each other. Smith had Frank Shamrock and TV actor Joe Rogan in his corner for the fight. Without question, the show stealer was Kung La, correct spelling, from San Jose, largely due to his wild offense of flashy kicks and powerful takedowns. He came off as a big-time crowd pleaser and a marketable guy, although the rules are suited for him. In strict kickboxing, he appeared he'd have trouble with top-caliber fighters as he was stunned a few times in this match, but the addition of takedowns is what got him over because his takedowns were just too cool, including power slams and flying scissors takedowns. Don Wilson looked good for his age, about 45, as far as being in condition and being ring-wise in there, but a combat ring is not a nice place for someone of that age. Yoji Anjo claimed that he would accept Kazuyoshi Ishii's invitation and fight in the K1 tournament in August to determine the Japanese rep for the K1 Grand Prix and challenged Masaki Sadake. If it's a shoot in a standing gloved fight, Anjo shouldn't stand a prayer against a top K1 star. ECW. The top matches on the June 6th ECW Arena show are Chris Candido and Lance Storm defending the tag titles against Sabu and Rob Van Dam, Justin Credible versus Jerry Lynn in an I Quit match and an 8-man cage match with New Jack and Spike Dudley and Tommy Dreamer and Sandman versus Dudleys and Jack Victory. The weekend saw the debuts on May 29th in Baton Rouge, Louisiana before a near sellout 1,750 and May 30th before a sellout 1,500 in New Orleans. The crowds were really hot both nights, but apparently the heat, as in sweltering temperature in the building in New Orleans, really hurt the show. There was nothing major new in Baton Rouge. In New Orleans, during an FBI vs. Supernova and Blue Meanie match, Taz showed up and suplexed everyone all over the place until Bam Bam Bigelow showed up. As they were being broken apart, Bigelow was supposed to throw Little Guido into the stands, however Guido didn't quite make it there and crashed and burned on the guardrail. Paul Heyman did an interview in New Orleans talking about one of the greatest matches he had ever seen being the Fantastics versus the Sheepherders, Superdome, April 19, 1986, and announced to the crowd that Tommy Rogers would now be serving as an enforcer referee. The crowd didn't react to Rogers at all. What people may forget is that while the Fantastics had a lot of tremendous matches in Mid-South and Crockett, they were never over in either territory. The biggest angle came after the Dudleys beat Sandman and Tommy Dreamer and Spike Dudley, where the Dudleys did their 3D move on Beulah, which will be the storyline explanation for her being gone for a while. New Jack tried to make the save, but Jack Victory clocked him with a guitar and Jack bled a sickening amount. Reports on Victory still aren't that good, with the feeling he's an 80s wrestler who is out of shape compared to when he worked in the 80s. There was nearly a major accident in the Sabu vs. Chris Candido main event. After Sabu won, Rob Van Dam showed up and threw a chair into the ring. Candido was laying on the mat selling and the chair hit him right in the shoulder and it was feared it broke his collarbone. He was definitely in a sling after the show, although we're told he will be working this weekend. There was also fear that Justin Credible suffered yet another concussion working with Jerry Lynn. The paperwork has been finalized in bringing Masato Tanaka in for 6 months. Nicole Bass returned and should be in full-time from this point forward with the exception of weekends where she has prior bodybuilding commitments. Credible was given his contract released by WWF, so he is ECW property and it isn't being developed by ECW for a return to WWF. This past week's TV aired Credible vs. Lynn from Philadelphia in edited form, and based on what aired it looked real good, although both try insane moves, which is why they both are getting banged up so badly. As for the Sabu and Candido vs. Van Dam and Storm match, the best thing to say about it was the angle came off well. Storm and Sabu worked terribly together while Candido and Van Dam worked well in a lot of spots, but even they weren't consistent. WCW. Latest on Ric Flair. Although Time magazine online threw out 40,000 of his votes for Man of the Century because they were fraudulent, he's moved back up to second place behind Mustafa Kemal Ataturk of Turkey. Basically the deal there is a competition between people from Turkey and pro wrestling fans from the US. Basically the Flair situation is something like this. Flair's attorney is attempting to restructure his contract before he returns. Among the items is that he wants travel days if he can't reasonably get to a city by leaving the day of the event to count against his maximum number of working days, that he won't have the money for the 4 missed dates claimed in the lawsuit deducted from his pay, that WCW indemnifies Flair, his agents and others acting for him from all lawsuits, damages, expenses and liabilities, including court costs and attorney's fees for any breach as a result of either negligence or a willing act by WCW, that WCW wouldn't be able to fire him from the contract unless he fails to appear to work when requested unless the situation isn't rectified for 15 consecutive days, and that if Flair were to suffer a career-ending injury during the terms of the contract that he'd be paid in full for 30 days, and at that point WCW would have the option to terminate the contract, but in doing so they would still have to pay him 50% of the money due between that point and the remainder of the contract period, which expires on February 15, 2001. If WCW breaches, then Flair could go to the competition, but if Flair breaches, there would be a period where he couldn't work for the competition for 120 days. They also want the contract to include US, Canada and Mexico, but WCW couldn't as part of its deal send Flair to any other country such as Japan, and that in the 3rd year of the contract, where Flair's pay drops from $725,000 to $500,000, that his maximum number of dates for that year would be no more than 32 dates per quarter. Although the legal fees are adding up for Flair, he is still getting paid on his $725,000 per year deal, because if WCW stops payment, it would render the contract breached and allow him to go to WWF. Is this any way to run a business department? Goldberg was on the cover with a full-page color shot on the entertainment pull-out section of the Central Maine newspapers with a page 2 story plugging his appearances on May 15th in Bangor, Maine and May 19th in Portland, Maine, with an interview with him. He did appear in Bangor, but not in Portland for the TV taping, which explains why fans were so upset at him not being at the show. Then going to Knoxville this past week, the paper ran a big story about the show focusing on the Steiner versus Steiner feud, and guess who wasn't on the show? Speaking of Steiners, Koch Steiner is working in Vancouver as part of the TNT movie sequel to Escape from Devil's Island that Hogan is doing. People are raving about the success, not in the least going to Goldberg's head, which is a lot more than can be said about just about everyone else in this profession who has been lucky enough to attain 1/10 as much instant success. Perhaps it's the background of being a real football player for so many years. Nitro on June 1st from the MCI Center in Washington, D.C. drew 12,768 fans, 10,523 paying $315,025, which was a huge house but also the first non-sellout for a Nitro in a long time. Show opened with a white limo and WCW had J.J. Dillon, Booker T, Diamond Dallas Page and Bill Goldberg come out. This only exemplified in fans' eyes how pitiful the WCW team must be when that was the best they could come up with. Ernest Miller beat Jerry Flynn in 403 with a kick to the face. Only thing notable was they did one of the worst sunset flip spots in history. Wolfpack came out with Luger and Nash challenging Hogan and Giant to a tag match in the main event. Hennig was out on crutches. Saturn and Raven beat Public Enemy in 642 when Saturn used the Death Valley driver on Grunge, but Raven stole the pin. Horrible match, like even worse than those Neidhart and Smith versus Adams and Hennig bouts. Rocco Rock was worse than Hawk and Grunge is tons worse than Animal. Raven and Saturn still weren't getting along, but Raven said he rehired the Flock to protect Saturn. In a booking on acid match, Alex Wright beat Chavo Guerrero Jr. with an SDF in 308. Chavo submitted before Wright even got the move on, then got up and began fighting him. Eddie Guerrero came out as the peacemaker and said that Chavo didn't have to fight him, but Chavo said that he thought he could beat Eddie. The logic behind Chavo submitting so fast to a nobody and then having Eddie act scared of him made even less sense than Rocky versus Farouk the night before. Gene Okerlund was hospitalized and we don't have any details, which is why Tony Schiavone was doing the interviews. Schiavone was looking huge. Savage came out and then challenged Piper to come out. He challenged Piper to a match after their tag match on the pay-per-view. I thought we'd already established this last week. Just what everyone needs is to get 2 Piper matches on the same pay-per-view. Piper then asked Savage if when he was a kid his parents built him a swing facing the wall. The line still got over, even though the first time I heard Piper use it must have been in the late 70s about Buddy Rose. He then talked about how Bret Hart was a smoother liar than Marion Barry, which wound up with the fans booing Piper. Piper was dying out there by the time this was over. Hogan and company came out. Piper had said that Hart was pulling a swerve on Hogan since he'd never worn an NWO t-shirt. Hart then showed he was wearing a Hogan t-shirt. Conan beat Lenny Lane with a Tequila Sunrise in 306. Not good. Hennig and Rude did an interview. Hennig was on crutches. His knee was suffering from inflamed jobberitis as opposed to tendonitis, which has to do with working with Goldberg. Hennig said he'd been training with Brad Rheingans, on Fry and Brian Johnston and hurt his knee and asked for Conan to come out. What percentage of the TV audience had a clue when they name-dropped Fry and Johnston and talked about how if he can handle Rheingans he could handle Goldberg? What wrestling fans know Rheingans today, and the very few who might remember him would remember him as a colorless prelim wrestler, even though the people in the business know he was a world-class amateur in his day and that Fry and Johnston are both tough guys in real life and wrestling stars in Japan. Hennig asked Conan to take his place in some small cities in matches with Goldberg, which Conan agreed to, and Hennig said he'd be back at the pay-per-view and win the title. It appears that somehow Hennig's knee won't be ready on the pay-per-view and that Conan will take that match as well. Hennig is expected at some point shortly to turn on the Wolfpack and return to Hogan's side since Nash doesn't want him on his side anyway. Just what Hennig and WCW need this week is another useless turn. Fit Finlay kept the TV title, beating Eddie Guerrero in 5 minutes when Chavo interfered for absolutely no reason for the DQ. No crowd reaction and a real bad finish. Then in absolutely the greatest part of the show, Chris Jericho was in a video in Washington, D.C. He wanted to meet with members of Congress and the president about the conspiracy against him, but the guards would turn him away and he acted like they were all in on the conspiracy. He was talking to this woman on the street corner about how there was this battle royal and Malenko was never in it. But he wanted and got the title shot. He ended up in a law library looking things up, getting mad because there was no WCW section in the law books. And he was on a street corner with a sign that read "Conspiracy Victim" pointing to him. Jericho beat Juventud Guerrera in 5:02 when Race used the neck-hanging tree slam on Guerrera and Jericho pinned him. Match was below par because Juvie screwed up a flying Hurricane Rana off the top and landed wrong and shook himself up. But later in the match he still did a slingshot pescado into a Hurricane Rana. Benoit beat Booker T with the crossface in 8:18 to go up 3-1. Good match, but a step below their previous Nitro and Thunder matches. Some talk of still aligning Benoit with Hart. Page beat Scotty Riggs in 1:55 with the Diamond Cutter, and Page after the match used the cutter on Sick Boy. Goldberg destroyed La Parka in 29. Actually, this was amazing. During the commercial break, Dave Penzer told the fans that Goldberg would be next. The place was going unglued. They sent out the Nitro Girls first and the fans booed the Nitro Girls for what I believe was only the second time in history. They were chanting Goldberg's name like crazy. Parka hit him hard in the head with a chair. Of course, Goldberg no-sold and destroyed Parka with a tackle to the point he destroyed Parka's knee in the process, and you can imagine with the inhuman amount of punishment Parka has been able to withstand what kind of a blow it must have taken to do him in. Parka's knee was legit blown out and it was believed he suffered a torn ACL and was on crutches at press time. Finally, in the typical terrible main event with the typical terrible ending, Luger and Nash beat Hogan and Giant via DQ in 6:38, when Hogan was DQ'd for hitting Nash with the title belt. Luger is now working in tight jeans. I'd say wearing tight jeans would make working difficult, but in the case of Luger, it's all the same anyway. Hogan threw ref Charles Robinson out of the ring and he and Giant were destroying Nash. Sting came to the ring wearing a black and white t-shirt, then as Hogan smiled, Sting clotheslined Hogan and ripped off the shirt, and he was tearing for all he could and couldn't get the thing to rip, to reveal in red and black shirt, and he smiled for the first time in years as the show went off the air. Unfortunately, on Tuesday nobody was smiling about it. Thunder on May 27th from Nashville drew a sellout 6,242 paying $98,376 and also drew a 3.21 rating and 5.7 share. Since it was on a Wednesday, nobody made much of a deal over the rating. The show was bad, although better than most of the recent shows have been. Hart did an interview telling Sting he should join the White and Black. Barbarian pinned Jim Powers with a high kick in 2:52. Real bad. Jimmy Hart took a bump from a Powers punch that missed by a mile. Davey Boy Smith returned, although he only looked slightly better than when he left, teaming with Jim Neidhart to beat High Voltage in 3:02 when Bulldog pinned Chaos with a power slam. Wolfpack did an interview. The fans actually booed Luger a little bit. Glacier beat Hammer via DQ in 3:55. Bad. Glacier used the Rings of Saturn, which brought Saturn out for the DQ. Raven then DDT'd Hammer, and Saturn used the Death Valley driver on Glacier. Raven and Saturn made up and Raven freaked out looking for Mortis everywhere, attacking WCW personnel until Mortis showed up and KO'd Raven with a cookie sheet. By the way, Mortis, or Canyon as he's now known, versus Saturn to the pay-per-view. Booker T pinned Benoit with a missile dropkick in 11:25. Great match, best so far. Finlay pinned Brad Armstrong in a TV title bout with the Tombstone in 5:39. Solid work, but it was old style and fans didn't care. Saturn beat Barry Darsow in 350 with the Death Valley Driver. Bad. Goldberg destroyed Barry Horowitz in 55. Finish saw Hart do an interview with Bischoff, who stayed in the background. Vincent, the Mike Jones won, not the McMahon won, and Giant out. Nash and his crew came out. It was originally supposed to be a tag with Sting and Nash versus Hart and Giant, but Giant had a bad knee. Nash is still recovering from his concussion and didn't want to work, and Sting had a bad knee, so they just did interviews. They spent the whole show teasing Sting would be there, and Sting was there, but he never appeared on camera, and the show just went off the air like that. May 26th in Memphis was the first Sting vs. Hart match, and it went 13 minutes, and Hart put Sting over clean with the Scorpion Death Drop. There will be a lot more bouts down the line. The co-feature was supposed to be Giant vs. Nash, but with Nash injured, Luger took his place and Giant did a clean job for Luger. Sting put on the NWO red and black t-shirt after beating Hart in Memphis. It's something WCW needs to think about, because the flow of information is so great it just makes the company look stupid running the angle on TV about Sting when at the house shows he's already putting the shirt on every night. Silver King suffered a waist injury in the dark match against Yuji Nagata on the June 1st Nitro, but no word how long he'll be out of action. Rey Mysterio Jr. is expected to return to shoot an angle within the next week or two and will likely have his first major match back on the July 12th pay-per-view show. Page was heavily politicking to get into the red and black attack. If the Hall turn made no sense when it happened, it makes even less sense now, as it's never been played up on television as being important, and Nash never even addresses the issue on his interviews, and Hall's name is barely even mentioned. Nash isn't wrestling on the next pay-per-view due to the concussion. Since the Janie Angle situation has brought up all the rumors of her being the daughter of Dory Funk Sr., there are many who believe it to be the case, but it is not a definite. Angle was in wrestling for years, working for Crockett out of Dallas before anyone talked about her being anyone's daughter. She moved to Atlanta when Turner bought out Crockett. In 1993 at Slamboree, literally as Dory Jr. was going to the ring for a Legends match against Nick Bockwinkel, she told Dory, who she had never met, that she needed to talk with him, and Dory said he'd do so right after the match. Then before he took another step, she said, "I'm your sister." Dory, deadpanned, said, "You'll talk after the match." If you actually know Dory, the thought is hilarious. This sounds like something you'd see on WWF television. Anyway, the late Stanley Blackburn, who was close friends with Dory Sr. and the entire Funk family, gave the story credibility at that time, and many believe it to be true, but as best we know, there is no actual proof. House shows this week saw May 26th in Memphis drew 7,087, paying $130,910, and May 28th in Knoxville drew a sellout 5,695, paying what could be an all-time city record of $107,345. Merchandise for the week was $301,424, or $10.20 per head. They really are going with the June 13th Pittsburgh house show main event as Goldberg vs. Conan, with nothing stronger than Benoit vs. Booker T as help. I guess we'll see what Goldberg means on his own. There are people who are trying to talk Ron Race into not doing a job for Juvie on the pay-per-view because it would look ridiculous. The idea has always been for Juvie to win due to outside interference from Hammer or Canyon. Thunder on July 16th from Oakland sold nearly 7,000 tickets the first day. Jerry Sags of the Nasty Boys, failed a lawsuit against WCW Nash and Hall over his career-threatening neck injury. Sags claims to have suffered a concussion and spinal disc injuries after Hall hit him with a chair at a house show in January 1997 in Shreveport. This was the incident where Sags went into the deal with the bad neck and asked them to take it easy. But Hall clobbered him with a chair, and Sags jumped in the ring and basically beat Hall's face in and knocked his teeth through his mouth. The heart of the case is whether or not pro wrestling is a sport. If pro wrestling is considered sport, Saganaj couldn't win money damages because Florida, where the suit is filed, has a law saying anyone who participates in a contact sport assumes the risks involved of the sport and can't sue. Tucker Bird, attorney for Hall, said whether pro wrestling is a sport is immaterial to the case because Florida state law also bars personal injury claims arising from physical exhibitions. Video Business on June 1st had a piece saying that since January, there have been a total of 1.2 million rental orders of pro wrestling videos, a staggering figure when you consider that in all of 1997 the total was 700,000. Of course, the article also stated that between 40 to 45 million viewers each week watched WWF and WCW on cable, which is more than double the estimated real figure of 17 to 19 million adding all the shows up. Hollywood Reporter on June 1st had a story on cable television basically saying pro wrestling and Nickelodeon programming dominate cable ratings. During the past season, figured as June 2, 1997 through May 24, 1998, pro wrestling shows were 6 of the top 7 original weekly series. For figuring purposes, the 3 specific hours of Nitro were listed as the top 3, followed by the second hour of Raw, the first hour of Thunder, and the first hour of Raw. The second hour of Thunder, which actually should be higher in the ratings than the first, was not listed because whoever was doing the research clearly missed an important detail. Rugrats was the highest rated non-wrestling series, placed between the second hour of Raw and the first hour of Thunder on the list. South Park actually drew higher ratings than many of the wrestling shows, but since this was based on total audience and Comedy Central is in 30 million fewer homes than USA, TBS, and TNT, fewer actual humans watched the show. It was pointed out that the total audience for the first hour of Nitro, which is 4.84 million viewers, as opposed to homes as is usually figured in the ratings, would only make it the 140th most watched television show in primetime if you compare it to the shows on the networks. In 18 to 49 audience, Nitro finished in spots 1 through 3, followed by South Park, the second hour of Raw, the first hour of Thunder, and the first hour of Raw. Again, no second hour of Thunder was figured into those rankings either due to clerical error. WCW Saturday Night on May 23 drew a 1.8 rating and on May 30 drew a 2.0. WWF King of the Ring on June 28 in Pittsburgh will have Austin vs. Kane for the title, Undertaker vs. Mankind in the Hell in a Cell cage, and the Final 4 of the King of the Ring tourney, along with a few more matches. About 9,000 tickets, or about half the building, was sold at press time for $355,000. Raw on June 1 from Chicago drew a sellout 13,681, paying $250,035 to the Rosemont Horizon. The card opened with a dark match where Golga pinned Dustin Runnels in what was said to have been terrible using a power slam. Edge beat Kevin Quinn in a match where both guys tried some high-risk moves and Quinn had an Eddie Guerrero look. Dick Togo and Shoichi Funaki beat Steve Boz and I believe Mike Anthony from Windy City Wrestling in a good match where the jobbers also impressed. 2 Cold Scorpio beat Jesus Castillo. Vader, still wearing his mask, pinned Chris Porter. Brian Christopher and Scott Taylor beat Headbangers. The Raw was tremendous again. The live show started with a McMahon confrontation with Mick Foley. Foley said he listened to the wrong people and called out McMahon. He said after his performance, even though he lost, because the match was so great, he still should be the #1 contender. McMahon called him a failure as a wrestler and a human being. McMahon, who had a cut above the eye from the chair shot, and the chair shot also knocked some of the caps off his teeth, and he needed to visit the dentist earlier in the day, while Foley was swollen under the left eye, probably from a chair shot. McMahon told him to get on his knees and apologize, but he wouldn't because his family was watching. McMahon dared him to hit him with a chair again, and when he was about 2, he brought up the mortgage on his house, his kids' college fund, etc. Eventually McMahon fired him. This segment was fantastic. Then came a taped street fight with LOD and Drostoff versus DOA, which ended in 4 minutes when Undertaker laid everyone out. Val Venis, who seemed more confident this time, beat Papi Chulo in 3:35 with a money shot. Undertaker, not wearing his gimmick so as to make the interview be out of character, came out and asked for McMahon to come out. The storyline now is that McMahon used Undertaker to beat all the wrestlers that McMahon knew his hand-picked champions could never beat, in reference apparently without saying to Hogan, Savage, and Hart. He said McMahon never wanted him as champion because he wasn't a good representative of the WWF, so his tenure with the belt was short. Then they all left for money, but he stayed loyal because McMahon gave him his break, forgetting that he couldn't go anywhere and keep his gimmick, and without the gimmick much of his value is gone. He waited for his time, and then McMahon forced him to fight his own brother and use his family tragedies as a way to build TV ratings. He said that he never lost his smile in reference to Michaels disappearing. While all that was going on, Austin went to the top and he praised Austin but demanded a title shot. It was interesting as without the lifts in his shoes, he only looked 3 or 4 inches taller than McMahon, who was about 6'2.5". McMahon was fabulous again, and basically said that his mother was a whore and if he could beat Kane, he'd get the title shot. Mero, who introduced Jacqueline as his new valet, beat Blackman with a shooting star press in 2:57 in a King of Ring first round match. An elimination 6-man saw Hart and Maivia and Brown beat Triple H and Outlaws in a very good match in 10:39. It came down to Hart versus Triple H, and Shamrock ran in and attacked Hart for the DQ. The Nation then all beat up Shamrock until Severn made the save, and it was almost comical. The two had a stare down before Severn bowed out. Triple H then jumped Shamrock for costing him the match and they had a pull apart. Jarrett beat Farouk in 3:21 after hitting him in the face with a belt buckle in another King of the Ring qualifier. Tennessee Lee brought out Southern Justice, the repackaged Godwins in suits, as JJ's bodyguards and a new tag team. The original plan was for the Godwins to be the bodyguards for DX and debut at the pay-per-view. However, with DX getting over his faces so quickly, having them with bodyguards made no sense any longer. Taka beat Funaki in 3:09 with the Michinoku driver in a good match. Al Snow was at ringside trying to look like a New Yorker stereotype of a Japanese person shooting photos. Henry pinned Terry Funk in a King of the Ring qualifier in 4:54 with a splash. Funk nearly killed himself to make this match, including doing an Osai moonsault where he crashed into the guardrail. It was actually a decent match. The booking committee should have been indicted on several felony counts for even suggesting this finish. Even though Funk is such a pro, he no doubt did it without even a complaint. Finally, Kane beat Undertaker to get the shot in 6:26 when Mick Foley came out as Mankind and distracted Undertaker. Bad match. Austin and McMahon both did commentary. After the show ended, Austin pinned Maivia with a stunner. Place gave 3 more stunners, 1 to Henry and 2 more to McMahon to end the show with a huge pop. King of the Ring bracketing has Shamrock vs. Kama, won by Shamrock, and Henry vs. Funk, won by Henry, leading to Shamrock vs. Henry, which Shamrock should win provided he didn't injure himself in 1 quarter. Farouk vs. Jarrett, won by Jarrett, and Blackman vs. Mero, won by Mero, leading to Jarrett vs. Mero. Then Vader vs. Rocky, which wound up as Vader vs. Henry, don't ask me why, in a no contest, and Triple H vs. X-Pac, which takes place June 15th in San Antonio, so whomever from DX will win that quarter. Finally, Severn vs. D-Lo, won by Severn, and Owen vs. Scorpio, won by Owen, leading to Severn vs. Owen. So Final 4 should be Shamrock vs. Mero or Jarrett, and a DX guy versus probably Owen. June 2nd, Raw from Rockford, Illinois before about 8,000 opened with a dark match with Turbo of Windy City Wrestling beating Quinn. Edge beat Jerry Fox with a DDT-like finisher. Decent match. Edge got a good reaction, although some catcalls from males for his long blonde hair. Taka and Bradshaw beat Anthony and Boz again. Southern Justice destroyed 2 jobbers before the match ever started. Kurgan came out with Jackal and Drew, including Paul Silva, who made Kurgan look small. Silva was billed at 7'7". Fred the Elephant Boy from Howard Stern did the ring announcing, so nobody had a clue who the jobber was, and Kurgan won with the claw and Luna had to pull him off to break the hold. Midnight Express beat Estrada Jr. and Vega when Cornette used one of the belts on Jose. Raw then opened with the 3 Musketeers in tuxedos, and I'm told Briscoe looked hilarious in his. McMahon claimed last week's Raw was the most watched wrestling show in history. McMahon claimed later in the show he was going to be awarded the Humanitarian of the Year award and wanted to extend the olive branch to Austin to attend the black tie presentation. Shamrock beat Kama with the ankle lock. He was attacked by the Nation. Without Maivia, who wasn't there with no injury, Angle apparently shot, and Severn made the save. Shamrock maybe legitimately re-injured his foot, as either he was working an injury or limping real bad by the time this was done. Farouk and Blackman beat Jarrett and Mero when Blackman pinned Jarrett, and the 2 argued after the match to set up their singles match later. DX was doing an interview when both LOD and DOA showed up, and it wound up with Slaughter ordering a triple threat match for the titles later in the show. Animal is now wearing new ring pants with the sides cut out similar to Brutus Beefcake in the 80s, which makes him look totally ridiculous. Even in Rockford, LOD barely got a bigger pop than DOA, and DX's reaction blew both away. Triple H said to be hilarious in this segment, partially making fun of the ineptitude of everyone else. Drostov vs. Chains ended with either Chains winning or a no contest, but it wound up with Undertaker choke slamming both. They showed a video of the 3 Musketeers with George Martin of the New York Giants and Darnell Autry, a backup running back with the Chicago Bears, who were going to present McMahon with awards. Hart beat Scorpio in a King of the Ring match with the Sharpshooter, which sounded like a good match. Vader, still with the mask, went to a no contest with Henry when Taker choke slammed both guys and left them laying. When the commercial break came, Vader got up quickly and walked away. Severn beat Brown in a King of the Ring qualifier. After the match, Hart attacked Severn, and a limping Shamrock made the save. Match had no heat. Runnels, wearing clothes that it said makes him look even more ridiculous than Goldust, went to a no contest with Venice when, you guessed it, Taker choke slammed both guys. Said to be a good match until the finish. The triple threat bout had those ridiculous Kevin Sullivan rules where the first man to score a pin wins, so it wound up with LOD and DOA each tagging an outlaw, who smartly saw Dog laid down, so Gunn pinned him, and since Gunn scored the pin, the Outlaws retained the belts. After a long break, They decorated the ring for the ceremony with George Martin, Autry and the Musketeers. Austin showed up with a black tie, jeans, and no shirt or jacket. Martin claimed he was representing Minority Athletes Network and said McMahon gave less money than he promised and his check bounced twice, and that his favorite wrestler was Austin. Autry represented the Hollis/Payton Foundation and also said Austin was his favorite wrestler. Austin ended up picking McMahon's pocket of $1,200 and gave it to the charities and called McMahon the tightest sob in the WWF. Taker's music played and Druids brought a casket to the ring. But it wound up with Kane coming out of the casket and Mankind coming from the other side of the ring. They did the Ultimate Warrior angle where they put Austin in the casket and Kane stood on top and he was stuck in there. I believe the show will go off the air at this point, although it ended with Taker making the save, Kane letting Austin out for no reason, Taker tombstoning Kane and Austin stunning Mankind. The biggest house show of the summer will be called Foot Brawl 98 on August 8th at Foxborough Stadium in Foxborough, Massachusetts. Pierre Ouellet was scheduled for knee surgery this week. Sonny was back this week. USA Network resigned the WWF for 3 more years. USA sent out a press release and made a crack against Turner in it. Stevie Richards was given a tryout as a color commentator. Only regular house show of the week was May 30th at Cobo in Detroit, which drew 8,464, paying $155,364. Merchandise combining Detroit and Chicago was $265,552 or $11.99 per head, which may be the highest single-week average ever. June 5th, Madison Square Garden had 14,000 tickets sold for $350,000 at press time, so a sellout is just about certain. Livewire on May 23rd drew a 1.4 and Superstars the next day did a 1.5, while Livewire on May 30th drew a 1.5 and Superstars drew a 1.8. The October 18th pay-per-view will be from Chicago and December 13th from Vancouver. Major house dates in September are September 13th in Anaheim, September 14th Raw in San Jose, September 15th Raw in Sacramento, September 19th in Detroit at Cobo, September 27th pay-per-view from Hamilton, ONT September 28th Raw from Rochester and September 29th Raw from Syracuse. June 14th in Dallas has Austin vs. Triple H, Undertaker vs. Kane, Vader vs. Mankind, Outlaws vs. LOD, Shamrock vs. Hart, Midnights vs. Skull and 8-Ball, Jarrett vs. Blackman, Taka and Bradshaw vs. Christopher and Taylor. June 27th Boston has Austin and Undertaker and LOD vs. Triple H and Kane and Outlaws, Shamrock vs. Hart, Maivia, first match back vs. Farouk, Funk vs. Mankind, Vader vs. Runnels, Scorpio vs. Mero, Bradshaw vs. Vega, Taka vs. Scott Taylor and Skull and 8-Ball vs. Quebecers.